on internally Welcome to this conference on internally displaced persons. My name is Beth Ferris. I am the director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University, and we've co-organized this meeting today with three other organizations: Refugees International, the Overseas Development Institute in London, and the Office of the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, Paula Gaviria, who will be with us this morning, and we'll speak in just a few minutes. A couple of housekeeping things to begin with. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A button at the bottom. If you need interpretation, we have live interpretation in French this morning, so just use the globe at the bottom of your screen. For other languages, you can click on the link in the chat, which will take you to a whole bunch of AI-generated other interpretations and translations as we go along. So please feel free to join in the language of your choice. We have two panels this morning. We'll begin by talking about the all-important issue of IDP participation. This was a theme of our meeting last year, and we talked about it further, at least some of us, at a conference in Montreal that we'll hear about. And the second one will focus on urban displacement, particularly in the context of climate change, and with a particular focus on livelihoods and how cities can adapt to the presence of IDPs to ensure that they're treated with dignity and respect. The world has changed in the last 2 months. Certainly since we began planning this conference, we've seen massive changes, largely instigated by US President Trump, with cuts in funding to humanitarian operations, which are affecting the lives of IDPs everywhere. We've seen changes in commitment to multilateral institutions. We've seen other governments following suit. So this is a very tumultuous, chaotic, uncertain time. But we know that IDPs are here, and IDPs are likely to remain regardless of policy changes. And so I hope that in this morning's discussion, we can focus on some of these key, important, transcendent issues of IDP participation and urban displacement. But I also hope we can take into consideration, the many changes that are affecting the reality within which these policies are made. So to kick us off, I'd like to introduce Paula Gaviria to you. She's a Colombian Special Rapporteur on the human rights of IDPs and has been a valiant champion of IDP rights for many, many years. So Paula, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We had hoped to have this whole conference in person. That was our plan, but some of the changes in the US made it very, very difficult for people to travel, particularly the many IDPs that we invited to participate in this meeting. But we're glad to have Paula here in person, although you will see her on screen. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, and all the distinguished speakers and guests. I am really deeply honored to address you today at the 2025 Global Conference on Internally Displaced People, organized, as Beth already mentioned, by Refugees International, Georgetown University, ODI Global, and my office. As Beth said, this is the second of such conference that we have organized to mark the anniversary of the guiding principles on internal displacement. So my sincere gratitude goes for Professor Beth Ferris for her being here, but all her trajectory at Georgetown University, as well as to Sarah Miller and others from Refugees International for providing this platform to discuss one of the most pressing challenges of our time in this turmoil and difficult times, internal displacement. We come together at a time of serious upheaval in the international aid system following dramatic cuts to US aid on top of already declining humanitarian funding. It is complex and painful for many of you and for many others who have dedicated to addressing displacement, and of course, not least, to the displaced people themselves. In parallel, internal displacement has not abated. People continue to be forced from their homes by conflict, disasters, violence, and other causes, including, and mostly, disregard for international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Often they are displaced more than once, escalating protection risks and impacts. We need only look to the latest crisis in Myanmar, where the earthquake did not replace the protection crisis, it intensified it. Similarly, in DRC, the latest hostilities worsened the already fragile and protracted protection crisis. Gaza, Sudan, Haiti, Ukraine are other examples of the multifaceted and growing internal displacement crisis gripping communities worldwide. Layers of protection risks increase harms to those affected, underscoring the urgent need for concerted action and solidarity on a global scale. Behind each statistic lies a human story of loss, but also of resilience and of hope. Their voices must be heard, their rights protected, and their dignity upheld. This is why I am particularly grateful that internally displaced persons and others with lived experience of forced displacement are with us today. Thank you to Yana from Ukraine, Laura from Colombia, Oumarou from Burkina Faso for being panelists. I look forward to hearing your messages. I also welcome others with forced displacement experience who join us online, and I look very forward to hearing from you too. I challenge all of us here today to discuss not only the struggles that this current crisis has generated, but also identify opportunities for us to mobilize and find our way through together. Even if our hand is being forced to change, we have an opportunity to ensure our change is strategic. The theme of our conference is shifting power and advancing protection. Let us leave the discussion today with actions that can keep internal displacement high on the international agenda and bring us closer to a world where internally displaced persons are more empowered and protected. As the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons, it is both a privilege and a solemn responsibility to advocate for the human rights and protection of those affected by internal displacement. This week, we are celebrating the 27th anniversary of the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, a landmark framework that outlines the rights of internally displaced persons and the responsibilities of national governments and others to protect and support them. As we mark this occasion, let us reaffirm our dedication to upholding the guiding principles and ensuring their implementation in practice. Since 1998, the guiding principles have gained considerably authority, recognized by more than 190 heads of state as an important international framework for the protection of internally displaced persons. The principles have also inspired the establishment of IDP-specific laws and policies across dozens of countries, from Honduras to Ukraine to South Sudan, and many of the people present here, reaffirming that national authorities have the primary responsibility to protect and assist their displaced citizens and residents. Now as Special Rapporteur and as co-lead with UNHCR of the IDP Protection Expert Group, we are working to support governments to better implement those laws and policies, including through peer learning between authorities from different countries and regions. Available in over 40 languages, they serve as the basis for IDPs to advocate for their rights and to participate in decisions that affect them. In this way, the guiding principles are an effective tool for people and communities affected by internal displacement to drive decision-making, something we will discuss in our first panel today. So where do we stand as a global community 27 years on from the establishment of the guiding principles? And how do we build on the momentum we have created in the face of unprecedented funding and other challenges? From the high-level panel on IDPs, of which I was a member, to the subsequent UN Secretary Action Agenda, and from the appointment of the Special Advisor on Solutions, Robert Piper, to the independent review of the ISC humanitarian response to internal displacement, we have made significant strides in shaping the discourse on internal displacement. The results hold significant potential for enhancing the protection of IDPs and achieving durable solutions. Collectively, the results work towards a more timely and joined-up response involving governments, IDPs, and the entire humanitarian development peace system for the start of a displacement crisis. This work has reinforced government's primary responsibility for the internally displaced and placed them and their rights at the heart of our response efforts. For all of the importance of policy processes, the time has come to move beyond rhetoric and prioritize implementation. As we are all aware, we now need to change the way we work in crisis, as countries' reports and evaluations have shown over the years. Concrete action is needed to translate our commitments into tangible outcomes for internally displaced persons on the ground. Most of all, we must do all we can to make sure that IDPs are involved in decisions about their future, and to ensure that already marginalized groups are not left even further behind. After all, they know their situation best and can best advise us on what they need to resume a normal life. Some of the stories of IDPs have recently shared with me are devastating. I have nevertheless been deeply heartened by the fortitude and determination of displaced people themselves, especially in a recent workshop with 12 IDP leaders that Beth already mentioned, and we're going to have Megan in a panel later sharing some of the stories and results. And here is where I see an important opportunity to shift in power, the theme of this conference. However, the question is, are we ready to relinquish power to national and local bodies and communities? How do we devolve power responsibly and sustainably? In conclusion, I extend my heartfelt gratitude for each and every one of you for your participation in this conference and for the work you have done for years. Let us seize this opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to upholding the rights and dignity of internally displaced persons. A lot of good work has been done, and we have a real chance now to rethink how to do even better. Together, let us work towards a future where displacement is no longer a barrier to human flourishing. Thank you, and good luck to us today.
Thank you so much, Paula. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you, Beth, for starting our session. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm Sarah Miller. I'm a senior fellow at Refugees International and one of the co-organizers of this event. I think we're all very struck by the comments and the opening that Beth gave us, and hopefully we feel motivated to seize on some of this momentum for the day. I have the pleasure of moderating the first panel, which, as we've discussed, will be on participation and power shifting, certainly in this unique context as the humanitarian system is changing drastically before our eyes. I'll offer a few introductory remarks before introducing our panel. For those who've joined late, again, you can click on the language icon at the bottom for interpretation into French, or my colleagues can also repost the link you can use to find other languages for translation and interpretation if you need assistance. You can also use the chat function to offer up questions, which my colleagues will pass to me as the panelists are presenting. Without further ado then, let me begin this session. And again, thank you all for joining us online. It's great to see such enthusiasm. We all know, and we've already emphasized, that the importance of IDP participation is increasingly recognized, but that much more needs to be done to turn the concept into practice. We all know in both the refugee and IDP context that it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Yet change has been very slow. And even on the refugee side, which one of our panelists will share expertise, there is also much more to be done to make participation meaningful. The good news is that there have been major gains. There are dozens of countries that have adopted laws, policies, and strategies. Yet again, there are still many ways, many challenges and places that we need to see progress in the normative and legislative dimensions. So this session is really a place to consider how IDPs see their own involvement and to think a little bit more deeply about what IDP participation means for shifting power within the system of IDP protection and assistance. We conceived of this conference in partnership with leaders who have experienced displacement, as well as colleagues from the UN, NGOs, academia, and elsewhere. And here at RI, we also think quite deeply about how we can strategically shift our own work to reflect this type of power shifting. But as Beth and Paula have mentioned, the conversation has changed. In recent months, again prompted by many of the aid cuts and freezes from the US, the landscape now looks very different. And we know that IDP communities are going to be deeply hurt. They already are being hurt by these cuts. In some ways, we think of this as a forced localization. We will surely see many displaced communities taking on the brunt as different organizations and groups have to close their doors, reduce staff, end programs, and stop their work in some cases altogether. And while they surely have the expertise, they will need resources to do this. And so we look to those who have studied, who have lived this out, who have worked on this issue for guidance in this unique context and against this backdrop. How can we think about power shifting and participation in new and meaningful ways amidst this context of cuts and dramatic shifts in the system? So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists who have thought about this quite extensively. First, I'll begin with my friend and colleague, Yana Liubymova, who is the founder of the Congress of IDP Councils of Ukraine and is a lawyer, human rights defender, and expert in women, peace, and security. She herself has been internally displaced twice, first in 2014 and then again in 2022. She was the head of the first IDP Council in Ukraine, which was created in 2019, and also co-authored the concept of IDP Councils. She's the head of the IDP Council under the Luhansk Regional Administration, and in 2023, Yana served as an advisor to the Vice Prime Minister on reintegration of the temporary occupied territories. She's also an IDP, a member of the IDP Advisory Group, which was assembled by the UN in recent years. Yana will be our first speaker, and she may also bring in other colleagues from the advisory group as they're able to share some of her information. And maybe I will introduce each panelist as we go, so we can go ahead and get started. Yana, I'll turn the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, dear colleagues. It's my pleasure to be in this panel as a panelist and present not only me as Ukrainian and me as a part of Global Advisory Board. And first of all, thank you, Sarah, for Refugee International, Paula from your report, and Beth from this big conference to be in Rio, and especially for special opportunity to speak in my native language. Colleagues, I'll try in Ukrainian. Could you please use the link for translation in the chat box, and I'll start my Ukrainian speech. Ще раз дякую, Сара, за те, що знаєш так глибоко мою історію. Дякую за підтримку Refugee International, українського досвіду і досвіду всіх людей, які зазнали вимушеного переміщення і міграції. Шановні колеги, друзі, партнери, мені надзвичайно приємно мати честь виступати. Сьогодні, як Сара сказала, я маю досвід переміщення двічі. І сьогодні, представляючи не тільки Україну, а як і глобальну групу радників з питань вимушеного переміщення при Офісі спеціального радника Генерального секретаря ООН, буду говорити про деякі аспекти глобального переміщення. Але хочу почати з України. В Україні ми створили унікальну модель участі внутрішньо переміщених осіб через мережу Рад ВПО, про яку вже згадувала Сара. І сьогодні ця мережа налічує 814 активно працюючих рад і більше 1000, які наразі створені і очікують свого активного запуску. Саме ці ради формують рекомендації до місцевих бюджетів, в тому числі і до бюджетів областей, регіонів, ведуть адвокаційні кампанії щодо житла, працевлаштування, освіти, адаптують політики до потреб ромських громад, жінок, людей з інвалідністю, людей з-поміж ЛГБТQ ком'юніті. І найголовніше, є реальними суб'єктами формування політик, а не просто бенефіціарами. І також, як вже згадувала Сара, ми створили концепт Конгресу Рад ВПО як загального координуючого органу, щоб допомогти людям, які сьогодні як волонтери працюють в радах ВПО. Це більше 10 тисяч людей в Україні і поза її межами. Багато з рад працюють онлайн. Допомогти цим людям набути навичків з професійної адвокації, мати можливість бути підтримкою для своїх громад та голосом внутрішньо переміщених осіб. Окремо, я вже згадувала, хочу презентувати вам наше напрацювання групи радників, в якій є 8, ми представлені з 8 країн світу, і ця група радників працює з січня 2024 року. До складу входять представники Колумбії, Ефіопії, Іраку, Нігерії, Уганди, України, Південного Судану і Ємену. Багато з колег моїх сьогодні тут. Я хочу поділитись презентацією для вас, для того, щоб показати це. Вже пробую це зробити. 1 секунду. Скажіть, будь ласка, чи ви бачите мій екран зараз? Сара?
Yes, it's okay.
Can you see my?
see it.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And just a second. Тут я буду говорити вже про наші рекомендації. Колеги, в мене презентація, як я вже говорила, це, власне, не мої напрацювання, це напрацювання наші спільні. І тут ви можете побачити, як саме виглядає, власне, мапа нашого включення. І колеги, з якими я працюю вже більше року, і маю можливість говорити не тільки від себе. Ці презентації ми готували в минулому році, в грудні мали можливість їх презентувати в Монреалі на конференції. З того часу, як дійсно казала вже Паула, світ значно змінився, і кілька попередніх спікерів, але загальні презентації, вони є все одно важливими і мають місце бути презентованими тут. Перша з цих презентацій, власне, як ви бачите, це посилення національного лідерства та відповідальності урядів. Вона лишається важливою, і закріплення участі внутрішньо переміщених осіб у національному законодавстві – це одна з найважливіших аспектів для того, щоб голоси ВПО були дійсно включені. Важливо офіційно визнати права внутрішньо переміщених осіб, брати участь у розробці рішень через відповідні закони і підзаконні акти. Проте формальні механізми є недостатніми. Часто для нас говорять про те, що наші голоси враховані, і вони не відображені в національному законодавстві. Тож реальна участь, ми підкреслюємо, є важливою. Ми хотіли би акцентувати увагу на запровадженні децентралізованого підходу, бо політики мають спускатися до кожної людини, яка сьогодні потребує допомоги, а це означає саме місцевий рівень. В кожній громаді має бути почутий голос тих людей, які цього потребують. Такий підхід дозволить врахувати контент та змінити, власне, ваги, сили, які розміщуються, на жаль, доволі часто тільки на рівні прийняття рішень, це національний рівень. Ми хотіли би говорити про зміцнення правових рамок і механізмів підзвітності, бо уряди мають, власне, створити і реалізувати ефективні механізми захисту внутрішньо переміщених осіб, включно з моніторингом процесу у напрямках сталих рішень і переглядом політики у разі її неефективності. А таке ми бачимо часто. Ми би хотіли говорити про залучення ВПО до прийняття рішень, підтримку органів самопредставництва ВПО, як рад ВПО або інших форматів такого представництва, об'єднань внутрішньо переміщених осіб, таких, якими можуть брати участь у розробці і впровадженні рішень на місцевому рівні. І про ролі міжнародних акторів в цьому процесі, як агенції ООН і донорів, які мають посилювати фінансову і технічну підтримку місцевих організацій і органів влади, включаючи організації, очолювані самими внутрішньо переміщеними особами. На жаль, в цьому якраз ми сьогодні і маємо зміни. Але тут важливо говорити про сприяння реалізації сталих рішень через інклюзію. Це і включення ВПО до процесів прийняття рішень, про довгострокові рішення, про підтримку нашого з вами процесу спільного творення цих рішень, і про підтримку організації людей, які залучені в цей процес, бо дуже часто лідери організацій, які очолюються внутрішньо переміщеними особами або мігрантами, вони зазнають тиску з боку урядів, якщо не провадять політику, яка подобається або яка підтримується офіціальною позицією країни. Ми би хотіли говорити про посилення міжнародної та регіональної співпраці, як про продовження інституційної роботи групи радників. І ми дуже дякуємо, що сьогодні агенція UNHCR продовжує підтримувати нашу роботу. Тут є колеги Надін, Марк, інші колеги, які тривало і довго підтримують. Знову хочу подякувати Паулі, яка постійно підкреслює, що наші голоси важливі, що включення людей, які працюють на рівнях країн, є необхідними для прийняття інклюзивних рішень. Важливо також сприяти обміну досвідом і децентралізації прийняття рішень, і регулярні контакти між країнами, між різними досвідами мають стати системними, включаючи участь внутрішньопереміщених осіб от в таких великих платформах і подіях, де ми можемо відверто говорити про наші потреби і проблеми. І розвивати онлайн-платформи для того, щоб була можливість об'єднати наші знання, бо в різних країнах є дійсно різні і дуже важливі досвіди, які би можна було запозичувати, покращуючи нашу політику в наших країнах, де ми працюємо. Як приклад, до речі, про онлайн, сьогодні в грудні в Монреалі ми говорили, що важливо підтримувати національні ідентичності, запроваджувати на онлайн-платформах можливість говорити мовами, якими говорять в цих країнах. І от сьогодні ми разом з колегами, дякую ще раз за цю можливість, тестуємо, як можна говорити українською і бути почутою для всіх 146 людей, які сьогодні до нас доєднались. Четвертий мій слайд про посилення стратегій у сфері внутрішнього переміщення. Він містить багато рекомендацій, як збір інклюзивної і гендерно дезагрегованої інформації, постійний як інструмент моніторингу для того, щоб дані про переміщення враховувались в розрізі вразливих груп, жінок, дітей, осіб з інвалідністю, національних меншин, щоб, власне, цільові засоби і були обґрунтованими, уникати причин переміщення, щоб політики, які приймались, мали зосереджуватись на запобіганні конфліктам, стихійним лихам і насильству, для того, щоб необхідно і, власне, забезпечували участь жінок у прийнятті рішень, Ми говоримо, що у відповідності до резолюції ООН 1325 важливо і необхідно створювати умови для участі жінок у всіх фазах від реагування до відновлення з урахуванням міжсекторального підходу, раси, інвалідності тощо. І планувати та підтримувати реінтеграцію, заходи, які мають бути розгорнуті для того, щоб залежність від міграції була зменшена. Окремо ми хочемо говорити про розгляд переселення як можливість, як рішення, щоб наратив про те, що людина автоматично є вразливою після переміщення, був зменшений. Якщо повернення або інтеграція неможливі, необхідно передбачити механізм внутрішнього переселення з відповідним аналізом ризиків до місця нового постійного проживання. І тут важливо говорити про фінансову сталість як інструмент підтримки, щоб країни мали можливість виділяти чітко окреслені ресурси для впровадження більш сталих рішень. Забезпечення і підтримка культури в умовах переміщення дуже часто культура людей, які переміщуються, зазнають переміщення, може зникати, і мають бути впроваджені заходи, які враховані під час реінтеграції. І, власне, локалізація і сталість – це те, що дуже важливо і наскрізно говорити. Я хочу тут припинити свою презентацію і окремо сказати ще раз, колеги, зараз секунду, вибачте, користуючись можливістю говорити своєю мовою, говорю трошки довше, аніж зазвичай. Як і говорила, ми презентували ці рекомендації в грудні 2024 року в Монреалі. Тут дякую колегам з університету McGill, які зробили це можливим. І вперше на такій великій платформі голоси внутрішньопереміщених осіб не просто звучали, вони формували зміст. Зміст цієї конференції. Ми порушили там фундаментальні питання, що означає внутрішнє переміщення не як концепція, а як практика. Як самі внутрішньопереміщені особи, такі люди, як ми, бачать це. І головне, як участь внутрішньопереміщених осіб може реально змінити баланс влади у системі захисту і допомоги. І відповідь, вона є очевидною. Участь – це не здатність просити, це здатність впливати і не просто бути присутнім. І саме тому, власне, вже в новому підтриманому UNHCR Advisory Board в цьому році ми говоримо, що в нашому новому плані мають бути представлені не тільки рекомендації минулого року, а й нові практики і механізми подолання бар'єрів участі. Як вже говорили колеги, ми в центрі гуманітарної кризи. Тому створення міжнародної платформи, яка би дала можливість внутрішньопереміщеним особам, мігрантам зі всього світу комунікувати постійно, яка міститиме навчальні матеріали і ресурси для посилення один одного, зробить можливість прозорої, інклюзивної процедури, туди включення для забезпечення прийняття професійних і інклюзивних рішень можливою говорити нашими різними мовами. І в тому числі, закінчуючи свою промову, хочу підкреслити, що сьогодні навіть прогресивна практика, про яку ми говоримо, це презентація наших напрацювань, рекомендацій, сталий діалог, сьогодні є під загрозою загального відкату. Про це говорили колеги в своїх презентаціях попередніх. Але важливо врахувати, що відкат, який ми бачимо в презентаціях, це не просто цифри, це життя людей. І тут важливо згадати про Україну, яка продовжує бути в війні 11 років. Вчора Російська Федерація обстріляла мирне населення, загинуло 34 людини, більше 100 поранено. Ми бачимо це і в таких сталих демократіях, як Америка, яка переживає замороження фінансування, яке впливає на весь світ. І висновок один – ми не маємо ніколи розслаблятись, не можна зупинятись, не можна припиняти адвокацію, бо все може змінитись за хвилину. єдиною гарантією наших прав є наша присутність, наші голоси і наша здатність бути в центрі прийняття рішень. Сара, дякую за можливість говорити.
Yana, thank you so much. Thank you for a thorough and important presentation that covered so much material, and for your dedication and your work. I think you really gave us a lot to think about, and I know you speak on behalf of other colleagues who helped form many of these ideas, and your dedication is very clear. So we will definitely circle back with additional questions. I hope the participants listening will start to think about the questions they might like to put in the chat. I'd like to turn next, we have a full panel, so I'd like to turn next to a combined presentation from Laura Marcela Borrero Fierro and Megan Bradley, who will discuss some of the findings from the McGill workshop. Very briefly, I'll introduce you both. Laura herself has been an internally displaced person in Colombia. Her grandfather was killed when she was only 1 year old, forcing her family to flee multiple times. In 2014, they had to flee again, and she has since excelled in her studies and become dedicated to the cause of many in need. She has studied law at the Universidad Simón Bolívar in Barranquilla. She has also founded an organization called Semillas por la Paz to support victims of the conflict. She continues as a lawyer specializing in administrative law and is now pursuing another graduate degree, a master's in governance and human rights, with the aim of supporting victims' rights and strengthening her leadership. She's joining us from Spain and will also be partnering with Megan Bradley, who is the professor and William Dawson Scholar in Political Science and International Development Studies at McGill University in Montreal. Her research has focused on refugees and internal displacement, humanitarianism, disasters, transitional justice, and accountability for human rights violations. She's worked specifically on international organizations such as UNHCR and IOM, and has served as the co-editor of the Journal of Refugee Studies, among many other accolades, and we're happy to share bios. She's joining us from Montreal, Canada. Megan and Laura, please go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Can you see our slides? Great. Wonderful. I'm just going to make sure everybody can see it in full screen. Thank you so much, Sarah, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to Laura for joining me in delivering our presentation today. It's always an honor to share the stage virtually as it is with you. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm based here in Montreal, and the presentation that we're offering today is just providing a summary of some important discussions that we had at the workshop that Paula and others have mentioned. This took place here in Montreal in December and was focused on the ways in which we can strengthen the participation of IDPs in processes at different levels, from the local to the international. So this is an event that was co-hosted with the Special Rapporteur, as well as with UNHCR and IPEG, the IDP Protection Expert Group. And this was really a unique event. In a lot of ways, I think it's been actually a career highlight for me. As Yana mentioned, the agenda for this workshop was developed collaboratively with a group of IDP leaders from Colombia, Honduras, Ukraine, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Iraq. And many of those colleagues are here today, and it's wonderful to see you, and I hope you can chime in sort of further sharing some of the conclusions from this event. One of the things that was unique about this workshop is that it is, to the best of my knowledge, the first time that such an international group of IDP leaders have gathered in person with UN and civil society leaders, as well as with researchers, to discuss IDP participation. So this was a chance to think about what we've learned in different national contexts, but also globally, and that was something that was really distinctive about this. So we've just completed the report from the workshop. This took some time because We have made it available in English as well as in French and Ukrainian, and you can see a link here to the report. We have also created a series of videos that share the perspectives of the IDP leaders who gathered in Montreal with us for the workshop, and those are also just now available at the link that I've shared here. And those are also available in multiple languages. If you would be interested in having any of this material available in languages beyond what we've done already, please do reach out to me directly. Laura and I will share our emails at the end. We're really keen to make this material available and have people read and use it, hopefully to support their own advocacy. So I want to start by saying thank you so much to all of the participants in the December workshop for sharing their ideas, which are really the foundation of our presentation today. So in addition to the report and the videos that I've mentioned, the IDP leaders who gathered for this workshop prepared a reflective piece on the question of IDP participation, which will hopefully appear in the Journal of Refugee Studies. And our presentation today is based on that reflective piece. So in that article, we draw out and reflect on 7 themes that emerged over the course of our conversations in Montreal. So first, in many ways, these resonate with the ideas that Yana shared, and they're by no means exhaustive, but the 7 themes that really stood out from our conversations were first, the importance of local and accountable approaches to enabling IDP participation. Second, the particular risks and challenges that come with working inside one's own country. Third, the need to balance approaches that focus specifically on IDPs as IDPs, to balance that with approaches that are more integrated, that think about IDPs as part of broader communities and the ways in which experiences of internal displacement relate to other identities and communities that IDPs are part of. Fourth, we reflected on the distinctive challenges that come with IDP participation in disaster contexts, particularly in relation to the growing effects of climate change, which will be the focus of the next panel, of course. Fifth, we talked a lot about issues of representation, of diversity, inclusion, equity, and intersectionality in IDP participation. Sixth, mental health issues as they relate to and as they affect IDP participation. And seventh, the value of international solidarity amongst IDPs. So building on national networks of IDPs to reach out across borders and think about how IDPs can connect with and learn from one another in a global way. So I'm going to briefly present the first 2 of these themes, and then I will pass it on to Laura, who will present the remaining 5. So in terms of this first question of local and accountable approaches to enabling participation, as we know, the states in which IDPs are displaced bear primary responsibility for protecting and assisting the IDPs within their borders. So this means that local and national approaches to participation and accountability are, of course, especially important. This is really the defining challenge. Many of the IDP leaders at the workshop, just as Yana did today, stressed the vital importance of ensuring that national and municipal laws and policies on IDPs explicitly address and protect their rights to participation, providing a foundation for participation at all stages of displacement. But as we heard during our workshop from Walter Kalin, who conducted an analysis of the ways in which participation are addressed in these national laws, currently only a small minority of national laws and policies on IDPs actually explicitly address participation. So we have a long way to go on that front. The participants in the workshop really stressed the value and importance of decentralized approaches to participation that don't just assume that national and international discussions are the most important or the ones where decisions are the most serious. They also emphasize that participation needs to be thought about as an ongoing process that accounts for the ways in which displacement changes over time. So participation mechanisms need to take account of the possibility of multiple displacements and the ongoing mobility of IDPs, including in the context of efforts to seek out solutions to displacement. For example, when people might return to their communities, we need to think about how to sustain participation mechanisms in those contexts. We also talked about how when IDPs continue to be mobile, the networks that they've founded to support participation can be strained. So there's a need to think about how to sustain these. During the workshop, we heard about some really important models for supporting IDP participation, such as the IDP Council system, as Yana has addressed, and also the roundtables on participation in Colombia, which Laura has been a big part of and can speak to further. We talked about the need and the value of sharing these models and thinking about how we can scale them up, and also the challenges that come with scaling up participation models such that perhaps thousands of people are involved in them. In these processes, especially around scaling up, the question of funding becomes very important, and that's all the more important right now in light of the global cutbacks. We talked about how funding brings particular challenges. It's obviously needed, but it also creates struggles over access to resources and transparency, raises questions about politicization as well, especially when funding is coming from governments, and governments may retaliate by withdrawing funding if the IDPs involved are not in agreement with the party line. And most importantly, we heard from IDP leaders that their efforts to promote participation are undermined when there's no external accountability. So that is when they carry forward the perspectives of members of their communities to national and international conversations, but then nothing changes in these processes and they have to return to their communities empty-handed. The leaders who gathered in Montreal really emphasized how this undercuts their own position in their communities. Second, we talked a lot about the risks and challenges of working within one's own country. So this includes security challenges like retaliation and harassment, threats and physical violence, including murder, and the ways in which these are compounded by corruption and impunity, and obviously undermine IDP mobilization and participation efforts. International partners can play a really important role in advocating for IDP security and making it clear that IDP leaders have international support. And this is something that can be sustained even in the context of contemporary funding cuts. We talked about some of the particular challenges that are associated with participation in the early stages of displacement when IDPs are struggling to get their feet under them. We talked about challenges like discrimination on account of displacement, and government crackdowns on participation, for example, in countries like Afghanistan. Given these risks, it was really stressed by the leaders at the workshop that participation can't be just a performance. It can't just be about ticking a box. It needs to be based on the recognition that IDPs themselves are best positioned to know their own needs and to speak to their own concerns. So I'm now going to turn it over to Laura to share the final 5 recommendations. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Megan. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. Sharing this panel with such empowered women as Paula, Megan, Sarah, and Yana will always be a great honor to me. And I will also like to thank each of my fellow leaders who participate alongside me in the workshop held in Montreal. Each of your contributions was essential for shaping this intervention today. So as a third topic, we talk about how there needs to be a balance between IDP-specific approach that are focused on IDP's distinctive needs and integrate approach that engage IDPs alongside other non-displaced community members, for example, in terms of reconstruction, development, and urban planning, right? So Also, we analyze how in research and practice on IDPs, we often focus on what makes IDPs different rather than what makes them belong. For example, for many IDPs, it's important for them to organize themselves in relation to their ethnic or religious communities, or perhaps as part of, like me, of women movements, or as a member of the LGBTQ community. This highlights the important role played by organizations led by internally displaced people, but also the need to be part of the community by getting involved in daily activities, which all allow for a more pleasant adhesion and prevent segregation by the community. So next, for as we all know, climate change creates increased risk of internal displacement, but there is still not a lot of understanding how IDP participation works in disaster contexts. In disaster contexts, there are often fewer formal participation mechanisms than in the context of long-term conflict. So we talk about the need to understand the challenge in more detail and learn from IDPs and other displacement affect community members in this situation. But also we emphasize the importance of recognizing for displacement as a consequence of climate change. This is especially important in the context of reconciliation processes, which are supposed to reduce the risk community face, but are often experienced as a form of displacement. So let's continue with fifth. We talk about the importance of diversity, inclusion, and equity issues in participation process. Participation is not neutral. The opportunity and ability to participate shaped by intersecting power structure like gender, like race, like class, age, and sexuality. In many cases, participation processes are dominated by people who are already comparatively privileged and may increase their power and compel the marginalization of those people who are the worst off. For us, this means we need to think carefully about the differential impacts of different drivers of displacement and the differential experience of displacement. In Colombia, for example, in my case, the mesas de participación efectiva de las víctimas have, that is like a participation space, have provided some important insights into this. In this space, displaced people are represented as well as those who have suffered various atrocities, such as sexual violence, enforced disappearances, murders, and torture, among other horrible situations. Additionally, they are the only participation space in Colombia that guarantees gender parity, meaning that at least half of the seats must be occupied by women, and they can only be replaced by another woman. They also guarantee direct representation for differential groups such as women, the elderly, ethnic group, members of the LGBTIQ community, youth, and people with disabilities. So we also in this topic talk about the particular need for greater attention to LGBTIQ IDPs. It's been quite a while that we have been talking about factors like gender, but there is still not much open discussion of the barriers that are faced by LGBTIQ IDPs. Even though around the world, many people continue to be displaced because of who they are and who they love. And we continue with the sixth topic that our conversation had like another thing that isn't discussed enough. the relation between IDP participation and mental health. IDP leader attending our workshop emphasized that mental health concern can be a significant barrier to participation, as these impact are double digit, right? First, generated by displacement, obviously, and second, by the pressure of assuming important role in defending the rights of displaced people and providing community leadership. So in this context, as our college Nestor Hernandez put it, self-care is an act of resistance. My college, who is a great and honored leader, emphasized the importance of supporting one another by sharing our success and effective strategies, but also by talking openly about failures. There is so much pressure for IDP leaders to be a success story, but it's also important to be able to admit that something didn't go wrong. And finally, we discussed the importance of providing displaced people leaders with the opportunity to share strategies with others within their own community and other part of the country. This will allow them, among other things, to learn how to participate in decision making and how to create projects and promote initiatives. Solidarity between IDPs in different countries can be a great source of ideas, but also encouragement and strength. Because of this, we are advocating for a global platform for IDP participation and leadership. We can come together more often to expand our community and build up a strong relationship and create like a project band, right? So to end, I want to say thank you very much again for the convener for the chance to share this summary with Megan, and especially to our colleagues who contribute to the development of these ideas. We look forward to your question, and if you would like to be in touch, please do. Our emails are here. And again, thank you, Megan, Sarah, for the invitation. It's an honor and a great opportunity to me to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Laura and Megan, again, for a really rich presentation, sharing the work of many people over many days and many hours is not an easy thing to do. So I appreciate the insights you drew, and also that this is one of the really first deeper and more substantive pieces that pulls together so many ideas. As we know, many people have been working on this issue for a long time. There have been other publications, but this is really the workshop was really the first of its kind. And so thank you both for sharing and for your dedication. I would like to turn now to our colleague in Burkina Faso, Oumarou Cisse. Before I introduce him, I will reiterate that while most languages you can get through the link that was in the chat if you need translation, we have French interpreters online. And so to hear Oumarou if you do not speak French and you need to hear, because his presentation will be in French, there is a globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may have to hit more. There may be 3 dots, and you can hit interpretation. And we have French interpreters on the line if you need help listening in French. Let me introduce Oumarou. We're so pleased he's able to join us today. He's the executive director of A2N Nodde Nooto in Burkina Faso. The organization, which translates into Ready to Serve, is focused on community development and partnering with local groups on sustainable development in the Sahel region. They focus on promoting equitable access to natural resources and environmentally friendly development. Oumarou has served as the administrator of the Environmental Intervention Fund and the president of the National Committee of Members of the IUCN of Burkina Faso, which brings together governments and civil society in preservation efforts. He studied at the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, and the University of Ouagadougou. Omar, we're so pleased to have you, and please go ahead. We will listen carefully.
Merci bien, Sarah, et bonjour à tout le monde. Merci beaucoup, Sarah, pour toutes ces informations qui, depuis pratiquement plus de 2 mois maintenant que nous sommes en train de préparer cette conférence avec beaucoup d'informations que Sarah a bien voulu partager avec nous. Merci également à tous ceux qui ont introduit cette conférence, Elisabeth, Paula, et évidemment tous ceux qui ont présenté leurs expériences avant moi, et notamment Yana pour l'Ukraine, et là tout de suite Laura et également Megan. J'ai suivi avec beaucoup d'attention tout ce qui a été dit, et donc évidemment ça fait pour nous également beaucoup d'informations par rapport à ce qui se passe ailleurs. Et c'est l'importance de ce genre de conférences pour nous, parce que ça permet de voir et de suivre également ce qui se passe ailleurs à travers le monde. Et malheureusement, ce sont des choses qu'on ne voit pas dans les médias traditionnels, et quand on écoute, il y a énormément d'informations, et d'un cas à l'autre, beaucoup de difficultés que nous partageons également avec les uns et les autres. Donc, c'est l'intérêt pour nous de participer à ce type de conférence et de partager également notre expérience. Pour ce qui concerne le Burkina Faso, vous savez, le Burkina Faso, aujourd'hui, c'est l'un des pays qui est confronté à une situation sécuritaire très difficile, avec un conflit qui touche pratiquement toute la sous-région. Et d'abord les 3 pays du Sahel central, le Burkina Faso, le Niger et le Mali. Mais également, de plus en plus, le conflit est en train de remonter vers les côtes, donc, comme le Togo, et le Bénin et le Ghana, qui sont en train d'être touchés aussi. Donc évidemment, on a observé le phénomène de déplacement interne, je dirais, vers le milieu de l'année 2018. Évidemment, cela nous a permis également de découvrir les mécanismes internationaux, les mécanismes de juridiction internationale par rapport aux déplacés internes, notamment le protocole de Kampala. Et je tiens à remercier d'ailleurs le réfugié international avec qui j'ai eu à collaborer sur l'application de la Convention de Kampala pour le Burkina Faso en 2023. Avec Alexandra Lamarche, on a fait un travail ici pour voir à quel niveau d'application le Burkina Faso, qui est un pays qui a ratifié le protocole depuis 2012, à quel niveau d'application le Burkina Faso était pour ce qui concerne le protocole de Kampala. Ça a été très instructif pour nous, ça nous a permis d'ailleurs pour nous de découvrir ce protocole-là, parce qu'il faut dire, parfois les instruments internationaux sont signés par nos pays, mais malheureusement très peu respectés, très peu vulgarisés, très peu connus, notamment par les acteurs au niveau local. La problématique des personnes déplacées internes et l'importance de leur participation au niveau de la protection et de l'assistance humanitaire, c'est quelque chose aujourd'hui qui se retrouve au centre de nos interventions, parce qu'il faut dire, depuis 2018, on a pris en charge les premiers mouvements de déplacés internes ici au Burkina Faso. Donc évidemment, dans un premier temps, ce n'est pas de sujet de préoccupation, parce que c'est un phénomène qu'on ne connaissait pas ici au Burkina, et lorsque c'est arrivé, personne ne se préoccupait d'approche ou de stratégie. L'idée, c'était plutôt comment très rapidement prendre en charge ce qui arrivait, avec beaucoup de difficultés d'ailleurs. Donc évidemment, dans un premier temps, ça n'a pas été la préoccupation. Pour que les gens sachent de quoi on parle, le Burkina Faso, c'est quand même 2,06 millions de personnes déplacées internes pour une population d'environ 20 millions. Donc c'est à peu près 10% de la population qui est en situation de déplacement maintenant. Et ça, il est important de le noter, que ce sont des chiffres, je dirais, officiels, qui date du dernier recensement officiel, parce que depuis mars 2023, le gouvernement n'autorise plus le recensement de personnes déplacées internes. Le gouvernement a décidé d'arrêter tout recensement de personnes déplacées internes parce que tout simplement c'est considéré comme une façon de donner une image négative du pays. Donc évidemment, on ne peut plus divulguer les chiffres des personnes déplacées internes. Donc les derniers chiffres officiels datent d'avril 2023, donc 2,6 millions. Et c'est important de noter aussi que en mars, le 14 mars dernier, le Premier ministre du Burkina Faso a déclaré devant la représentation nationale que le gouvernement a réinstallé plus d'1 million de personnes déplacées internes dans 700 localités du pays. Évidemment, c'est des chiffres qu'on ne peut pas vérifier, nous les intervenants, parce qu'aujourd'hui, dans le travail que nous faisons, il nous est même interdit de collecter des données pour pouvoir faire les enquêtes pour l'évaluation des besoins. Il faut des autorisations, il faut une autorisation signée par le ministre de l'Action humanitaire, une autorisation qui est très difficile à obtenir. Il faut faire parfois pratiquement 1 mois de procédure pour avoir l'autorisation. Pour faire les PDM, donc les enquêtes post-distribution également, il faut des autorisations. Et donc on a énormément de difficultés pour disposer de données parce que les enquêtes sont très encadrées et parfois même, je dirais, interdites. Pratiquement chaque semaine, nous recevons des messages du gouvernement nous intimant d'éviter de faire de collecte de données, de faire des enquêtes si nous ne demandons pas des autorisations spécifiques, donc évidemment des autorisations qui sont difficiles à obtenir. Donc les chiffres sont vraiment très rares, très difficiles à obtenir. Et donc évidemment, cela impacte aussi la façon dont nous faisons notre travail. Et nous n'avons que très peu de chiffres en ce moment sur la situation des personnes déplacées internes. Alors, pourquoi, comment est-ce que les personnes déplacées, qu'est-ce que nous faisons d'ailleurs? Je tiens d'abord à souligner le travail que nous faisons avec les déplacés internes. Nous, en tant qu'organisation, le travail que nous faisons avec les déplacés internes, c'est l'assistance humanitaire à travers des distributions de vivres, à travers les distributions d'abris, à travers des renforcements des capacités, notamment la sensibilisation sur l'assainissement, donc tout ce qui est WASH, à travers également des kits pour potabiliser l'eau, parce que c'est absolument important l'accès à l'eau dans cette zone, dans cette région-là. Burkina Faso, l'accès à l'eau est très, très, très compliqué, donc il faut distribuer des kits de potabilisation de l'eau parce qu'il faut parfois utiliser des puits pour boire. Et les puits, ce n'est pas de l'eau potable. Donc, on a des kits de potabilisation de l'eau qu'on met à la disposition des personnes déplacées internes. Il y a aussi tout ce qui est lié au dépistage de la malnutrition et à la prise en charge des enfants malnutris que nous faisons également. Et il y a enfin, et ça c'est une activité très importante pour nous, l'aspect lié à l'identification et à l'établissement des extraits de naissance et des cartes d'identité nationale pour les personnes déplacées internes. Ça, aujourd'hui, c'est absolument important comme activité pour nous parce que les personnes déplacées internes, c'est majoritairement des populations rurales et malheureusement, les populations rurales ne sont pas généralement identifiées au fichier national. Alors qu'avec la situation sécuritaire actuellement, on peut perdre la vie tout simplement parce qu'on ne dispose pas d'une carte d'identité. Donc, évidemment, c'est absolument important aujourd'hui que nous identifions toutes les personnes déplacées internes. Donc, nous faisons des opérations d'identification des personnes déplacées internes avec les services du gouvernement et que nous appuyons à aller faire du recensement, de la distribution des extraits de naissance avec les mairies, l'établissement des cartes d'identité également pour ces personnes-là. Alors, je reviens sur la question de la participation. Comme je l'ai dit, ici, lorsque le phénomène de déplacement a commencé au milieu de l'année 2018, les interventions ont été fait pour apporter une réponse à la situation de ces personnes-là, parce que c'est un phénomène qu'on ne connaissait pas, donc qui venait de subvenir de façon absolument brusque, brutale, parce que parfois les gens partent avec rien du tout, parfois les gens arrivent avec rien du tout, donc évidemment, il fallait tout de suite voir comment est-ce qu'elle est venue en aide, parfois juste en distribuant de la nourriture. Et donc, en ce moment-là, l'approche de la participation n'était pas à proprement parler une préoccupation pour les acteurs comme nous, et évidemment, même pour les organisations internationales dont le principe humanitaire, qui était familier avec le principe humanitaire. Je n'ai pas vu qu'il y avait une préoccupation particulière pour ce qui concerne la participation. Donc, on était sur une approche top-down de l'assistance humanitaire, et la participation a été en quelque sorte complètement escamotée pour faire face à... Mais en même temps, ça se comprenait parce que tout le monde était dans l'urgence. On ne pouvait pas non plus s'attendre à ce que les personnes déplacées internes soient préoccupées par le problème de la participation, de la prise en charge de leurs besoins, dans la mesure où elles-mêmes étaient en quelque sorte perdues, et donc évidemment s'attendaient seulement à ce que leur situation, leurs besoins soient pris en charge rapidement. Donc ça, c'était le premier phénomène qui faisait qu'on ne parle plus de participation en tant que telle. Et évidemment aussi, on était dans une situation où on ne mesurait pas l'ampleur du phénomène de déplacement, les raisons, les causes profondes du déplacement des populations étaient encore mal connues, mal maîtrisées. Donc on se disait que c'était un phénomène ponctuel, passager. Et la réponse aux besoins, d'ailleurs, dans un premier temps, il faut le dire, les humanitaires et les organisations comme nous autres sont venus, je dirais même en deuxième ligne, parce que c'est les populations hautes des localités qui accueillaient les déplacés internes qui se sont d'abord impliquées. C'est elles qui sont rentrées dans une sorte de solidarité agissante et qui ont été les acteurs de première ligne pour accueillir ceux qui venaient, ceux qui fuyaient leur localité. Donc évidemment, la question de la participation en ce moment ne se posait pas. Elle se posera bien plus tard, je dirais, parce qu'à peine on a quitté dans ce contexte où il fallait rapidement répondre aux besoins des personnes déplacées internes, donc des personnes qui se déplaçaient, qu'on est tombé dans la pandémie de la COVID-19. Donc évidemment, là aussi, avec tous les confinements qui ont été sauvagement mis en place ici, c'est un peu différent de ce qui s'est passé peut-être à l'Occident. Ici, il y a eu des confinements que je dirais qualifiés d'un peu sauvages parce qu'aucune disposition n'avait été prise. On a juste fermé toutes les routes, on a fermé tous les marchés, on a fermé toutes les boutiques, on a tout fermé en quelque sorte dans une désorganisation totale. Il n'y avait absolument aucune organisation. Et pendant ce temps, on avait des personnes déplacées internes sous la main qui n'avaient donc accès à rien du tout. Et ça a été une période très difficile. Évidemment, il y a eu de l'intervention, évidemment, il y a eu de l'assistance, mais à un niveau absolument catastrophique en termes d'organisation. Donc, tout ça a fait que dans un premier temps, la question de la participation ne se posait pas et n'était pas véritablement une préoccupation. Aussi bien pour les acteurs humanitaires qui n'ignoraient pas évidemment tout ce qu'il y avait comme principe humanitaire, mais vous conviendrez avec moi que la COVID-19 a un peu désorganisé tout le système, tous les processus, tous les dispositifs. Évidemment, ce n'était pas quelque chose de facilement à prendre en compte dans un pays où le système même d'organisation est absolument rudimentaire. Lorsqu'on voit les processus qui sont en place, et surtout les accès également. Donc il y a tout ça qui faisait que dans un premier temps, la participation n'était pas en tant que telle une préoccupation. C'est avec maintenant la persistance du phénomène d'insécurité et les populations qui arrivaient de façon absolument massive, qui transformaient des localités comme Dori, comme Kaya, qui passaient, Dori par exemple, qui passait de 55 000 habitants à pratiquement 300 et quelques mille habitants, Kaya qui passait de 100 000 habitants à absolument 500 et quelques mille habitants. Donc ça devenait un phénomène absolument colossal et qui était dans une sorte de désorganisation totale. Et évidemment, il fallait absolument repenser l'action des intervenants, aussi bien des humanitaires que de l'État lui-même. Il fallait repenser le dispositif parce qu'il y avait une sorte de désorganisation généralisée qui faisait que la réponse n'était plus tout à fait adaptée. Le dispositif n'était plus en charge et évidemment, les personnes déplacées internes aussi, l'urgence passée, les premiers mouvements passés, les gens ont commencé à tirer des enseignements de différents intervenants. Donc évidemment, les personnes déplacées internes commençaient aussi à s'interpeller, même par rapport à la façon dont ils voyaient que les choses s'organisaient. Et ils voyaient évidemment qu'il y avait une sorte de désorganisation autour des intervenants. Ils voyaient aussi qu'il y avait une sorte d'inéducation de dette qui était amenée. Et ça, c'est fondamentalement c'est cette situation qui a mis en quelque sorte la participation au centre de tous les processus, tous les dispositifs, parce qu'évidemment, si les premiers concernés trouvaient que l'aide était inadaptée, donc il fallait absolument recadrer les choses. Elles ont parfois, dans certaines localités comme Dori, le camp de Wendou par exemple, les déplacés internes ont elles-mêmes pris en charge l'initiative de s'organiser pour essayer d'orienter la façon dont on leur aidait. C'est-à-dire qu'il fallait absolument, ils se sont organisés de telle sorte en quelque sorte obliger les intervenants à commencer par l'État, parce que c'est la CONANEF, donc le Conseil national de secours d'urgence et le Comité national d'assistance des réfugiés et des personnes déplacées internes qui devaient s'occuper maintenant d'organiser les zones, les camps de déplacés, et donc les organiser en zones d'accueil des déplacés. D'abord, il y a 3 niveaux. Il y a d'abord les sites d'accueil temporaire, où on accueillait les déplacés de façon urgente, le temps de trouver un camp plus adapté. Donc, il y a ce qu'on appelle les sites d'accueil temporaire. Ensuite, il y avait les zones d'accueil des déplacés, qui étaient des zones maintenant reconnues, plus formelles, organisées, avec un certain nombre d'infrastructures, où on avait des comités communautaires mixtes, où il fallait absolument organiser les communautés qui étaient dans différents camps. Soit il y avait des groupes, soit par localité d'origine, et ensuite, si on organisait les groupes en localité d'origine, on les organisait ensuite en termes de représentativité sur un comité qui est en fait le comité central au niveau du camp, et dans lequel d'ailleurs on impliquait les personnes, les populations en fonction de la localité où les personnes sont accueillies. Soit c'est le quartier qui est à côté du camp, soit c'est le village, les villages qui sont à côté du camp, ou parfois, pour certains camps, il y a des villages et des quartiers, compte tenu du fait qu'on peut être dans une localité comme Dori, mais le territoire sur lequel est installé le camp n'appartient pas de façon traditionnelle à Dori, mais plutôt à des villages qui sont aux alentours. Donc les comités communautaires mixtes, là, on essayait de coopter aussi bien les habitants de Vélou, étant un secteur de Dori, mais également des villages qui sont autour du camp, et pour mettre dans ce comité-là. Et ça, c'était absolument fondamental parce qu'on constatait aussi qu'il commençait à y avoir des tensions entre les communautés, parce que les communautés hautes qui avaient, dans une sorte de solidarité agissante, accueilli les déplacés internes, les avaient même assistés avec leurs moyens, et qui avaient accueilli les familles dans leur propre domicile. D'autres avaient donné leur champ pour que ces gens-là construisent leur camp. Et parfois même au début, donner une partie de leur champ pour qu'ils tirent. Mais lorsque l'aide venait, l'aide était plutôt dirigée vers les personnes déplacées. Donc on était dans une sorte de situation où on voyait que les personnes déplacées internes étaient en train de devenir en quelque sorte de privilégiés par rapport aux personnes qui les ont accueillies. Donc il fallait mettre un peu d'ordre à tout ça. Donc évidemment, les comités communautaires mixtes ont permis d'impliquer personnes hautes dans toutes les décisions qui étaient prises en matière d'assistance, en matière de protection, également en matière d'évaluation des besoins. Et nous, on s'appuyait finalement sur ces comités-là pour faire tout ce qui est enquête d'évaluation des besoins, pas nous-mêmes de façon spécifique, parce qu'il faut dire que, entre-temps aussi, au niveau des intervenants, les gens qui sont organisés en cluster avec les organismes des Nations Unies, avec des organisations internationales humanitaires. On a mis en place des clusters par secteur d'intervention et évidemment, tout ce qui concerne les enquêtes spécifiques d'évaluation des besoins était soit parfois mené soit par les clusters ou soit par des organisations comme les nôtres, tout simplement, mais en tout cas en concertation avec les comités communautaires mixtes qui étaient devenus en quelque sorte des organes incontournables dans les activités d'assistance et de protection humanitaire. Alors, il faut dire, ça c'est absolument important. Il y a aussi que le fait pour les personnes déplacées internes d'avoir à un moment donné, pour certains pendant plusieurs années, pensé que c'était un phénomène qui allait passer. Donc, on espérait, il y avait un espoir que les gens allaient répartir dans leur localité d'une façon ou d'une autre. Donc, la façon dont l'intervention se faisait, leur implication n'était pas une préoccupation en tant que telle, parce que pour eux, bon, c'est ponctuel, ils sont là, ils ne sont pas forcément d'accord avec ce qui se passe, mais ils sont là de façon ponctuelle, ils finiront par partir. Donc, quelle que soit la façon dont c'est fait, s'ils arrivent, ça arrive à les aider un temps soit peu, la façon dont c'est fait n'était pas absolument important. Maintenant, les gens ont compris à un moment donné que c'était un phénomène qui s'estompait. D'ailleurs, l'espoir de
Omar,
répartir.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Excuse me, just the interpreter has asked if you can speak closer to the microphone so they can hear you better for the interpretation. Sorry to interrupt you. Can you speak closer to the microphone?
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
I want to déplacer me parce que je vais me déplacer.
Maybe just to have a clearer sound. Thank you.
Yes. Now, I think it's okay.
Yes, we have a few more minutes and then we'll take some questions
Okay.
for the last panelist.
So, now it's okay?
I think so. Yes, it's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
We
Donc,
just have maybe another minute or so. Thank you.
Okay. Est-ce que c'est bon pour l'interprète? Ok. Et donc, je disais que l'espoir de retour rapide s'étant volatilisé, évidemment, les gens, il y avait beaucoup d'activités, notamment des activités génératrices de revenus qui faisaient que les gens, n'ayant plus l'espoir de retour, donc évidemment, se sont intéressés à leur avenir, à la façon dont ils pouvaient se repositionner dans ces localités où ils étaient forcés de se déplacer. Donc évidemment, cela a aussi, en quelque sorte, reboosté, je dirais, cet aspect de participation, de leur participation dans tout ce qui concernait les interventions à leur endroit. Donc ça fait partie pour moi des phénomènes, des étapes essentielles dans la participation des déplacés internes. Maintenant, il est absolument important de revenir sur, pour moi, ce que j'appelle la problématique même de la participation en quelque sorte, lorsqu'on regarde tout ce qui concerne comme on appelle l'intervention en quelque sorte je m'excuse, l'intervention des acteurs. Et pourquoi la participation? Parce que c'est de ça qu'on a parlé. Et c'est un aspect absolument important parce que tout simplement, on considère que ça fait partie de l'implication des cibles dans la prise de décision par rapport à ce qui les concerne. Et ce qui les concerne ici, c'est la protection et c'est l'assistance humanitaire. Et évidemment, c'est eux les cibles. Et donc, évidemment, c'est absolument important qu'ils soient impliqués dans la prise de décision. Et on constatera bien plus tard que pour nous, dans le contexte du Burkina Faso, ce qu'on appelle conceptuellement transfert de pouvoir, plutôt ce que nous appelons ici les aspects de la prise de décision, donc la participation à la prise de décision, notamment pour moi, il y a 3 étapes. Il y a l'évaluation des besoins. Donc ça, pour aujourd'hui, il faut dire que c'est déjà le cas. Les personnes déplacées internes sont absolument impliquées dans tout ce qui est l'évaluation des besoins. Et ils sont même, je dirais, des acteurs incontournables aujourd'hui dans tout ce qui est l'évaluation des besoins, donc l'évaluation, mais également l'identification de la réponse. Et ça, c'est des choses qui sont aujourd'hui courantes et qui font partie des processus d'intervention de tous les acteurs humanitaires et qui sont ancrés dans les habitudes des uns et des autres. Et maintenant, il y a la participation à la mise en place de la réponse à tous les niveaux. Ça, ce n'est pas encore le cas, je dois l'avouer. Il y a encore absolument du chemin à parcourir pour en arriver à cette situation et de la mise en place, notamment de l'aide à tous les, de la protection, de l'assistance à tous les niveaux, parce qu'il y a des phénomènes comme la violence basée sur le genre, qui sont des phénomènes absolument difficiles à toucher dans ces communautés, encore, il faut le dire, où la tradition est beaucoup ancrée. Nous faisons énormément de sensibilisation sur la violence basée sur le genre, mais on constate que l'implication de la communauté, et notamment des femmes, est encore quelque chose à gagner. Et ça, ça ne pourra se faire qu'à travers une communication accrue pour le changement de comportement. Et donc, c'est ce segment-là que nous sommes en train de travailler actuellement. Et il y a aussi l'évaluation et la portée de l'assistance. L'évaluation pour savoir concrètement, est-ce que l'assistance qui est fournie répond fondamentalement aux besoins des personnes déplacées internes et la portée, qu'est-ce que cela pourrait avoir comme impact sur leur vie. Ça aussi, c'est un segment sur lequel on a malheureusement du mal à évaluer la participation ou en tout cas constater la participation des personnes déplacées internes. À mon avis, ces 2 derniers segments sont des segments où la participation est encore très, très, très faible. Et donc, évidemment, on peut considérer qu'il y a encore du chemin à parcourir dans la participation à la prise de décision. Donc, ce qu'on pourrait éventuellement, ce qui est pour moi le niveau vers le transfert de pouvoir. Parce que ici, pour nous, le transfert de pouvoir, c'est lorsqu'on arrivera à une situation où les personnes déplacées internes sont impliquées, donc leur participation est déjà acquise, ce qui, à mon avis, est le cas aujourd'hui, mais également qu'elles sont au centre de tout ce qui est fait pour elles, et parfois que cela soit fait avec elles ou par elles. Donc, moi, je considère que c'est ça le transfert de pouvoir. On l'a vu, on a une petite expérience avec les réfugiés, par exemple. On intervenait dans les camps de réfugiés à Goudbo, les réfugiés maliens qui étaient au Burkina au début des années 2010. Et on était arrivé à une situation où on avait des centres d'alphabétisation où donc les enfants des réfugiés étaient alphabétisés selon un système qu'on appelle le système de passerelle. Il s'agit de récupérer des enfants, de faire une formation rapide entre 3 et 6 mois et de les intégrer dans le système formel du Burkina. Et c'est les réfugiés qui faisaient eux-mêmes les formations, c'est eux qui ont été cooptés pour tenir les classes. On avait donc un programme où toutes les activités étaient menées par les réfugiés. Les sensibilisations étaient menées par les réfugiés. Les programmes d'alphabétisation étaient déroulés par les réfugiés. Donc, il y avait juste un suivi que nous faisions en termes de coordination avec les services compétents de l'État. Et pour les personnes déplacées internes, on n'en est pas encore vraiment là. Et donc, pour moi, il y a un niveau auquel on n'a pas encore atteint. Et ça dépend de beaucoup de choses pour qu'on en arrive à ce niveau-là. Et il y a beaucoup de maillons qui manquent à la chaîne. Et le premier maillon, c'est la volonté politique. Donc, j'en parlais là tout à l'heure par rapport aux difficultés que nous-mêmes nous avons pour travailler aujourd'hui avec les personnes déplacées internes. J'en parlais à Sarah de l'activité de distribution des cartes d'identité que nous faisons actuellement. C'est une activité que nous avons commencé depuis pratiquement 6 mois et jusqu'à présent, on a du mal à avancer parce que on n'a pas véritablement, on ne voit pas en quelque sorte la volonté politique. Nous, on est à un niveau où on n'a absolument aucune capacité à avancer dans cette activité si les organismes gouvernementaux ne sont pas impliqués, parce que c'est véritablement eux qui délivrent les extraits de naissance, c'est eux qui délivrent les cartes d'identité. Et c'est vraiment difficile d'avancer. Donc, moi, je parle de la volonté politique, c'est le premier niveau. Ensuite, il y a la volonté de la communauté humanitaire, donc tout ce qui est l'intervention. Et évidemment, nous, les intervenants, il faut qu'on accepte et qu'on mette au centre de nos stratégies et cette approche qui remet les déplacés internes au centre de toutes les interventions, comme l'exemple que j'ai donné, par exemple, pour les réfugiés maliens, notamment le fait que c'est les réfugiés qui conduisaient les activités de sensibilisation, c'est les réfugiés
Omar,
qui...
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt. I think we are running short on time. Would it be possible to follow up during some of the questions so we can continue with one more panelist? I'm so sorry to stop you. Thank you for the rich presentation. I hope you can hear me. I want to make sure we have time. We have one more speaker.
Oui, non, j'ai fini, donc je pense qu'on peut avancer. Je pense que c'est bon, j'ai fini, j'étais sur les recommandations et les trucs, donc on peut avancer, il n'y a absolument aucun souci. Je voulais juste parler du renforcement des capacités nécessaires à ce transfert de pouvoir. Mais je pense que c'est bon, on peut avancer. J'allais finir avec la situation des financements américains, mais c'est bon, je pense qu'on peut avancer.
Okay, thank you so much, Omar. I'm so sorry we don't have enough time for as deep of discussion as we want, but you've given us so much rich information. Your work is incredibly impressive, and I know we'll have time in the question period to follow up. Thank you again, Omar. I want to introduce our final speaker. We have Jean-Marie Ishimwe, who is the East Africa Regional Lead at Refugees Seeking Equal Access to the Table, our seat. And he's filling in for Mustafa Alio, who was unable to join us, but we're really glad to have you, Ishimwe. Ishimwe is responsible for promoting the institutionalization of meaningful refugee participation and refugee leadership at the state level in the East African region. Before joining our seat, he was the director of Youth Voices Community since 2019, where he fostered a collaborative approach to addressing the needs of refugees in Kenya related to social economic inclusion and self-reliance. And he continues to advocate for refugee economic inclusion through the Future of Wakimbizi campaign. He has lived much of his life in Kenya, as I understand it, and studied at the University of Nairobi. He, of course, is bringing some of the refugee-specific perspective to apply to the IDP context. So Ishimwe, thank you so much for joining. I know it's late in Nairobi, so we really look forward to your insights on some of the learning we can take from that context. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah, for the opportunity. I'm just joining from a meeting I was attending, but I hope you can clearly hear me. Let me start by saying thanks to you, Sarah. Thanks to Refugee International. Thank you for organizing such an important discussion. We, as RCIT, are very humbled to be part of this discussion. In fact, Mustafa was looking forward for this, but due to unavoidable circumstances, he couldn't. I, as you've said, work with RCIT in East Africa, here in Uganda and Kenya. I'm particularly based in Nairobi, but do my work within the two countries. Allow me to build much of this conversation from what the rest of the colleagues have already discussed, because I think it's not always as easy to discuss or to actually submit after everyone. but I think it gives me an easier work to more or less discuss various issues, particularly in regard to this topic, that I see relevant from our experience from the refugee sector and how that relates to the IDP question in place right now. And allow me to start actually by saying that I don't particularly see sometimes a big difference from the challenges that IDPs face to the refugees. While they might be very unique and different for both of them, some of the systemic challenges that refugees, but also IDPs face are almost similar, even though they are unique in different contexts for sure. I have to start by also saying that in the landscape that we are currently in, where there's a huge funding cut and of course the chaos in the world right now, there's always a tendency to have an excuse of not having participation as core to some of this very important policy or decision or programming within the international space, but also within the local space, because it might be seen as a burden in that regard. But I think that excuse, while it stays sometimes, it's a question of what is the understanding of refugee participation within the larger context. But in this case, actually for IDPs, and you will hear me talking a bit more on refugee participation, but that might actually be very possible to engage within the larger IDP context. And I have to say also, as a refugee here in Kenya, I have heard various stories from IDPs, and I think in terms of participation and really engagement of these communities who are largely marginalized, it's really a question of how do they take part in finding solutions for their future, which under normal circumstances, that future is not many years to come, is not many months to come, but it's actually living today. And so out of the 120 million and above forcibly displaced people, at RCIT, we always talk about refugees or forcibly displaced people having the power to influence decisions about their lives today, tomorrow, and in future. We have a very specific element of how we engage within the refugee or the global refugee regime as it regards to refugee participation, which I will be trying to give a little bit context of our experience and the lessons we've learned. But maybe also to say is that one of the things we've seen, especially within the refugee context, has always been the question of why and the question of how. The question of why to engage marginalized communities and the question of how to engage these communities. I think from a refugee point of view, since the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees, this discussion has moved a little bit further. And I think from the rapporteur, I think when she was starting, she made reference of guidelines that are also relating to IDPs. And I think that is crucial to say because foundational, I think it is the instruments that we have, whether the laws or the policies, that sometimes actually even or make it difficult for refugees or for marginalized communities to participate. Specifically for refugees and for RCIT, we base our work under paragraph 35 of the Global Compact on Refugees, which under paragraph 35, it speaks about states, non-states, governments, various actors that are within the refugee response, finding space to support communities, refugees, and various groups such as women, young people, and PWDs, and the rest of marginalized communities to be able to participate meaningfully in the solutions that and into the initiatives and programs that are intended to protect and assist them. In essence, to say that for effective responses to any IDP-related programming, policy, or decisions, that then it's important to cement the role and the need to have IDP participation, and in this case, sometimes for us, really refugee participation for that regard. But I think even in the larger context, it's also a question of saying that while there is the chaos in the world right now, that presents a very important angle to think about participation for communities in the regard to the role they can play in a very overwhelming situation where donor funding is not as much as it was, and there is, of course, uncertainty. Then what role can communities themselves, IDPs and refugees, be able to contribute to solving the issues they relate to and they experience at the daily. During COVID-19, for us especially, we saw a little bit more of the refugees and refugee-led organizations coming up from their invisible operations, where many times they were not recognized because they really couldn't get a chance to be up and be able to participate as much and given that role. But at our seat, our work has shown us within the global space that there's no one fits all type of participation for communities, marginalized or refugees or IDPs for that case. So we have various types of participation. For our seat, we are always championing for engagements, particularly with states who are very important within the global refugee regime, on working on what we call the institutionalization of refugee participation at state level. So looking at beyond feedback, beyond consultations, how can the refugee skills, the IDP skills in this case, be of value from a technical expertise position to actually, in essence, discuss more substantially than to be more or less like a tick box within that discussion. And so we've seen a lot of growth for that process in real sense to say that since, for example, 2019, during when the first Global Refugee Forum happened, there's been change of that participation in real sense. So we are seeing a lot of kind of what I would describe as meaningful engagements within the international level, but we're also doing, and this is why I'm here in East Africa, trying to champion the same for the countries within the hosting countries to also adopt the mechanisms that we work. So we are championing for refugees with technical expertise to engage at that level to really avoid what we've seen for a long time within the spaces as performative vis-a-vis the idea of how refugee participation, in this case, ID participation, can be a tool for effectiveness or efficiency of programmings for IDPs and refugees in that case. And so over time, and I think even within the IDP space, there's various forums, high level or national various, that I think contextually from our RC perspective then allows us to say that there are various types of modes. So there is community type, like councils of, for example, refugee organizations or refugee leaders. There is some of those, like, for example, in Uganda, where they have a refugee engagement forum that government engages with the refugees. But then there's also what now we work on, which is the refugee advisory mechanisms that states directly are able to engage with refugees' technical expertise on various topics that pertain the refugees. And I think that might be a good lesson for the IDP space as well, to look at what are some of the opportunities with regards to moving away or actually complementary, finding the opportunities to use the skills of the IDP, to utilize their skills and bring them at the table to actually discuss more substantially, both for their lived experience as IDPs, but also for their skills and the expertise they have. We have seen also some of what I would call systemic challenges that, of course, for refugees is different as compared to IDPs, whether it is visa challenges or lack of documents that even IDPs face. And so you find that some of these systemic issues make it very difficult for groups, marginalized groups, to interact within the international level for engagements where decisions about their lives are being taken. For example, in the Global Refugee Forum 2023, we had at least more than 20 refugees, some coming from the Global South, being denied visas from the account of them being refugees and nothing more. And so it shows some of the discriminative types of systemic challenges that exist within the system. But I think it's the same challenges that IDPs face, especially with access to documentation, but then when not having them hinders that process. Allow me to also say maybe a few more other things relating to this topic. One, of course, it is understanding that the question of participation is not just a good thing to do, or even as one of the colleagues talked about, Sarah, I think, a smart way, but really as a means for effective programming and decisions and policies for the groups that those policies or decisions are intended for. So it is not a tick box idea here, but it's more of how do the system rethink the role and the work that refugees, IDPs can play in building their future, which essentially, as we always talk about, them as being either fast responders or experts within their lives, because they've lived this life, then it is important to look at their role and rethink how do we pass, and that perception, I think, is what we've seen and working with UNHCR at the global level, seeing that things are starting to change, that there's a new dispensation of thinking of groups, particularly marginalized, on how they can actually have a significant role in that process. I think what we've seen, and I think good for the interactions we've had with UNHCR in this regard, we've had things like the advisory body or board for UNHCR that has refugees and forcibly displaced people from different organizations that are coming to engage and guide and support UNHCR in how engagements and decisions are made in programming. And I think that's the way to go. I think it is using allies like UNHCR to, telling the truth when it's not actually conducive for groups like IDPs and what certain structural and systemic challenges that they face, from perception, from lack of documentation, from being invited late, from lack of resources and fast responders over time, even as shown in COVID.
Ishimwe, we have frozen. I don't know if you can hear us. We seem to have lost your connection. Yana, I think you can hear me, yes? Yes.
Yeah, I
okay.
hear you very well. Yeah.
Okay, we'll give Ishimwe a few seconds to see if his connection resolves. If not, we can come back to him.
And I see the question hour.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can move to questions and hope Ishimwe's connection resolves. If you can hear us, Ishimwe, thank you for your presentation. Yes, I think he's disconnected, but we will circle back. I appreciate all of these rich presentations. Thank you so much, everyone, for a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge, and a lot of time and energy that's been put into better understanding this issue. We do have a little bit of time for some questions. I have many. I've been taking many notes. I've been writing a lot, and I have some that have come through in the chat. So what I will try to do is combine the questions.
Sarah, I lost my internet. Do you hear me last? I lost my internet at some point. Can I just finish the last part, and if you allow me? Sorry for that. I'm using data bundles because my internet is not working.
Oh, it froze again. I'm sorry, Ishimwe, your internet is not being kind to you. We will try again when it resolves. Sometimes internet just does not cooperate. All right, so let me turn to some questions now. So we have, what I'll do is probably group them because I want to make sure we can use the most of our next 15 or 20 minutes with our panelists. So please do feel free to submit a question through the Q&A button, which you can see on the bottom of the Zoom, and my colleagues will try to pass as many as they can to me. So I'll do some grouping here. I've heard some interesting themes and important recommendations that I think we can pull. I appreciate that Ishimwe was also saying that sometimes we make these arbitrary distinctions that don't need to be there in terms of labels. And, many of the issues we learn in the refugee space, we can apply to the IDP space. But I've also heard the importance of some of the very kind of specific methods of coordination, of funding, of accountability. And I think all of us are thinking about these in the context of aid cuts and how do we understand as this system is changing drastically. And Ishimwe, you've returned. I'm so glad. We'll try to give you a few extra minutes as we're doing questions to resolve some of your thoughts. So Yana, I'll give to a few groups, but I wonder if you could speak specifically about the involvement of women. I know you have worked a lot on the inclusion of women and what participation looks like in that context in Ukraine, and also in terms of some of the cuts that you're seeing and what you're seeing real time. Megan and Laura, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to external accountability and some of the practices you saw there. And I also, if you'd like, and there's time, perhaps to unpack some of the mental health components and the notion that participation is not neutral. I thought those were some very interesting concepts. And so if you have some additional thoughts there along both of those lines, let me see. I want to make sure I get some from the audience as well. One individual asks, the power dynamics for collaboration among IDPs in different countries, how do we see that their living conditions and economic and living status may not allow them to access communication with people in other countries? So I think that would be a question around connectivity. So I would invite any of the participants who would like to comment on that question. One additional question from the audience relates to dismantling of the US refugee system and how that might be affecting some of the wider network of support for refugees, but also IDPs. I had one colleague who said, will we start to see IDP numbers increase as simply channels are shut down, as people are not able to leave and perhaps take a path, find refuge elsewhere? How will that affect IDPs? And so we might think about that in the participation context as well. How can people engage in their situations in these contexts? Just looking through a few other questions. Maybe I'll start with those. So maybe that would be to Yana, Megan, and Laura first, and then I'll come back to Omar and Ishimwe for some additional. Yana, please.
Thank you, Sarah. And first of all, thank you for this powerful reflection. Yeah, it was really interesting. And just a quick, I don't know, reflection from my side. And I see the question in our chat. As a global displacement system, Retrack and Donor prioritize shift isn't more urgent than even to build decentralized community-led networks that connect IDPs and refugees leaders across the borders. While unequal access to resources and community remains a challenge, international platforms as our today's event or like the emerging global peer-to-peer space initiative by the IDP advisory group, I mean our IDP advisory group, can help bridge these gaps. The core issues remain consistent: lack of legal recognitions, barriers to services, exclusion from decisions, of course, and enduring trauma. That we need now is not just more programming, but redistribution of power from top-down responses to direct leadership and participation by the displaced people. Time solves. And about Ukraine, Of course, in Ukraine, women affected by the displacement have played a key role of shifting recovery policy, leading IDP councils, and advocating for housing, employment, and protection. Ensuring their full participation is not only a matter of rights, but essential of effective community-driving solution. Displacement women are central to recovery and decision-making in Ukraine. Over 60% of IDP council chairs are women, according to research by Stabilization Support Services. My colleagues who work also with IDP Council, support IDP Council and Congress of IDP Council in Ukraine. They lead advocacy, women's lead advocacy, livelihood and integration at the local level and national level as well. Their role is also reinforces of Ukrainian's nation action plan of UN 3025. It's in Ukraine we have a third plan actually, and now we started the process of update our current plan. And supporting their participation is not only a matter of equally is a foundation for effective inclusive solution. And now our Ukrainian women stay not only as participants and plus as combatants next to our men and help us to build our peace Ukrainian future. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Yana. That was a comprehensive answer. And I know just the tip of the iceberg of much of the work you've done with women that is critical. I think it also echoed some of what Ishimwe said about there being a much deeper, richer, not just sort of a tick box exercise, but really, really critical. Megan, maybe I'll turn to you and you may have to speak on behalf of Laura. We seem to have lost her, but I threw quite a bit at you, but maybe you want to pick up on a couple of those points from your side. And then I'll turn to Ishimwe and Omar in a moment.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry Laura has had to step away. It would have been great to hear her kick off in responding to these questions. Briefly on external accountability, I'll respond here by thinking, as somebody who sort of sits at an international university and spends time thinking about what international actors can do in this issue, it strikes me that academics as well as human rights advocacy organizations, I'm thinking of, some of the larger international organizations that play really important watchdog roles. We can do more to be reporting on IDP issues, to be insisting on coverage of IDP issues, and in particular, drawing attention to some of these failures when there is a lack of external accountability. I think one of the problems at the moment is when there is little external accountability, there's no consequence for that, which is, of course, part of the problem. It's relatively easy to convene a conversation with people, but then to actually move forward on it, that's where the rubber hits the road. And there's, I think, not as much done as there could be to try to create some consequences, even if it's only reputational, for when there are failures on that front. On the issue of participation not being neutral, in the conversations at the workshop, and maybe Yana or others would want to jump in on this, it struck me that this is true in two ways. I think many people were saying that participation is often presented as if it's inherently good, or at least it can't hurt to try to, create spaces for participation. But what we often heard from IDP leaders at our workshop was that, it can be actively detrimental if it just causes people to spin their wheels, if it raises risks and security challenges. So we shouldn't think it's neutral, and we shouldn't think it's necessarily good. And it's also not neutral in the sense that it actively builds on and can sustain pre-existing inequalities, right? So the issues that Yana is speaking to about participation of women, for example, the issues that we've flagged about LGBTQ participation, for example, this is all part and parcel of that. So the value here, I think, is in having an approach to thinking about these issues that isn't just thinking about IDPs as IDPs, but the way in which they sit in broader power relations. And I guess this connects to the issue of mental health concerns, in part because I think participants at the workshop were really stressing that this is something that isn't talked about enough. I think that we need to know more about this issue. I see Laura has been able to jump back in, so maybe she can also share some thoughts that she might have. So I think that this is an issue that we need, count on the researcher to say we need more research, but I think it is something that we need to understand better. I think we need to learn from the practices of groups like our colleagues at Honduras Diversa, who really raised this issue a lot with us and have, in their own work, I think, taken some active steps to try to raise this concern and respond. One thing that was very striking to me about the work on mental health issues that was shared with us by, for example, our colleague Nestor Hernandez at Honduras Diversa was that this work has to think about IDPs not just as IDPs, but as members of their communities, as members of their families. You can't just have an intervention that sort of zooms in on the fact of internal displacement. You also need to think about, are people parents? Are they caregivers? What are their struggles and aspirations in their life more broadly? So, Laura, there were questions on mental health issues, accountability. I don't know if you wanted to jump in on any of that. I know we're sort of coming in just as you were able to come back onto the call. Oh, you're muted.
Can you repeat slowly for me, please? Because, my English is not the best, right?
Sarah, was there anything in particular that you might want to hear from Laura?
No, Laura, what you can do is just keep listening and join as you like. Megan gave some further thoughts on mental health, on accountability, and some of the ways that IDPs are perhaps viewed in too narrow an understanding as opposed to kind of some of the wider context. So as we converse, you can add as you like. Maybe what I'll do now is I'll read another question from one of the audience members, and we can see if there are other responses. So this individual asks, how can we improve our ability to modify programs, policies, responses to better take into account IDP preferences on ways to enhance their possibility toward restarting their life when policies and systems continue to be shaped by international and often foreign systems? These representation structures are certainly useful, but if we start seeing, for example, a change in practices by displaced people, for example, by trying to move abroad, that organizations are not able to support for political or funding reasons. So I think this question speaks to some of the wider context. We know that the power is still entrenched at different levels. And I guess I would also challenge us and perhaps ask, do we see that changing? As organizations are pulling back, as staff are let go, as resources are cut, I would be curious how you see some of the landscape changing. Is coordination looking different? Is decision-making different? Maybe it's too soon yet to know how some of these effects will happen, but maybe I would add that to that question. Feel free to answer that. Omar, I would also be interested in hearing a bit more about some of the coordination structures that you found most useful in Burkina Faso. And then I'll turn back to Ishimwe. Omar, could you offer a few thoughts? And again, for those who need French translation, you can hit the interpretation globe button at the bottom. Omar, please, if you have further thoughts on coordination to enhance participation. I think you're still muted. We may need to unmute you, Omar. Sorry, I think we're not hearing you. Your microphone is on mute still.
D'accord. Là, je vais changer de place parce que mon microphone, malheureusement, il est fixe, il ne bouge pas.
We hear
Je vais
you.
changer de place. D'accord. Donc, merci bien, Sarah. J'ai bien compris la question. Alors, pour le Burkina Faso, il faut absolument noter d'abord pour ce qui concerne des aspects de l'impact ou l'influence externe. Vous savez, on est dans une situation sociopolitique un peu fragile ici au Burkina Faso avec des élans plutôt patriotiques assez poussés. Et surtout, on est dans une sorte de sentiment un peu réfractaire aujourd'hui à tout ce qui est extérieur. Donc ça, c'est quelque chose que je tenais absolument à souligner, ce qui fait que ça rend le travail pour tous les acteurs humanitaires un peu difficile, surtout pour ce qui concerne des approches je dirais, importé dans l'humanitaire. On est confronté à cette situation et évidemment, ça pose des problèmes avec certains donateurs, ça pose des problèmes avec certains partenaires parce que le principe humanitaire, il est unique, il ne change pas en fonction des pays d'intervention. Donc, on essaye, nous, en tant qu'intervenants locaux, de faire un peu la part des choses. Et je pense Megan a évoqué un aspect qui est absolument important ici au Burkina Faso, et c'est l'aspect sécuritaire en lien avec la participation des personnes déplacées internes, donc leur mise à contribution. C'est d'ailleurs l'un des facteurs que j'ai de méfiance aujourd'hui parce que malheureusement ou heureusement, c'est long, mais il y a quand même, on constate aujourd'hui des allées et venues des personnes déplacées internes entre leur localité d'origine et surtout pour les hommes, parce que les camps sont peuplés essentiellement de femmes et d'enfants, et les hommes sont soit dans les sites orifères ou font des va-et-vient, et donc évidemment, ces va-et-vient font qu'il y a une suspicion autour de certaines personnes déplacées internes quant à leur connivence avec les groupes armés, par exemple. Donc, ce qui fait que leur implication est pour nous un sujet très sensible parce que il y a absolument beaucoup de vérifications à faire. Il y a également des difficultés parce que nous, on a eu par exemple des situations où on a travaillé avec des personnes déplacées internes et ensuite on a été en quelque sorte interpellé par l'Agence nationale de renseignement qui nous posait énormément de questions. Quel est le lien avec ces personnes-là? Donc évidemment, il y a cet aspect à tenir compte. Je pense aussi, Sarah a souligné un aspect ici par rapport à l'évolution des besoins, peut-être qui fait qu'il y a certaines personnes déplacées internes qui ont aujourd'hui des besoins qui ne peuvent pas être pris en charge par les acteurs du fait, comme on appelle, de la disponibilité des ressources. Nous, ce qui nous embête sur ce sujet, c'est surtout par rapport à des thématiques comme les violences basées sur le genre et tout ce qui est en lien avec la diversité. Vous savez, je reviens à la dernière idée que je n'avais pas pu aborder lors de la présentation, c'est les financements américains qui ont été coupés. Et pour certains, qui ont été réactivés, on nous a demandé tout de suite de ne plus mettre l'accent sur les interventions, par exemple, sur les violences basées sur le genre, sur tous les aspects de la diversité. Donc, évidemment, ça nous fait nous retomber dans nos travers parce que nos sociétés sont essentiellement des sociétés patriarcales où la participation de la femme n'est pas forcément un sujet absolument essentiel dans certaines communautés, mais qu'on avait pu, à travers tous ces projets-là, à travers tous ces programmes-là, qu'on avait pu quand même améliorer. Et donc aujourd'hui, on se retrouve dans une situation où il faut faire en quelque sorte un grand écart avec l'idéologie conservatrice du donateur et puis la pratique qu'on essaie de mettre en place en encourageant la participation des femmes, en essayant de sensibiliser les communautés sur toutes les violences, sur tout ce qui est en lien avec les violences basées sur le genre. Et donc, évidemment, tout ceci en faisant aussi l'écart entre ce que les autorités actuelles, leur position, en quelque sorte, réfractaire de tout ce qui est importé, parce qu'on parle aujourd'hui de néocolonialisme, d'impérialisme, bref, tous ces slogans révolutionnaires qui font que nous qui avons évidemment des collaborations avec des acteurs externes devons absolument et de façon absolument prudente travailler en évitant d'être taxés comme par exemple des relais locaux d'impérialisme qui sont des concepts qu'on entend beaucoup actuellement. Donc voilà ce que j'avais à dire à ce sujet.
Thank you so much. Thank you for looping back as well, Omar, to some of those questions and key issues on the significant impact that the community is feeling, and for these insights. Ishimwe, are you still able to hear us? I hope your connection.
Yes, I can hear you.
Great.
Yes, I can hear
I
you.
want you to have the last word so you can return to what you wanted to cover and perhaps engage on a few of these questions in our last few minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the previous colleagues have already said a lot more. I think I just wanted to go back to what I think Megan mentioned on the participation not being always necessarily something that people want. I mean, I might have forgot the question, but really, I think it's important for us to recognize that for most of the challenges that we face, both for IDPs but also for refugees, unfortunately, has been the question of participation. But in regard to this is really the meaningful part of it. Oftentimes, communities get frustrated engaging in processes that don't bring any change, don't bring any impact to the issues that they face every day. And this is the frustration that most communities will say, and especially for countries that might be very restrictive in nature from a law perspective, but also from some of, whether it's LGBTQ or IDPs or, there are certain countries, certain groups that are not always providing the space. And I think whilst there's always that question of, is it a good thing for participation? I think for me, it is paramount for participation to happen in the most genuine and transparent and equally meaningful way. Minus that, then the communities and marginalized group will always feel the frustration. And I think one of the colleagues also mentioned about when you go back to the communities, they are not seeing the change they want to see. And I think that landscape within what the US funding cuts that has happened actually says to us. I think there's more of a deliberate effort, even right now, more to think of impact and think about how funding relates to impact, more deliberate and intentional. And that can only happen if the communities that are most affected, like the IDPs and the refugees, are part and parcel in that process. We've seen for ourselves, for many programs that don't involve the communities, they always don't answer to the systemic issues that the communities are facing, but equal to the priorities that the refugees have and both the governments have. And so I think that landscape of the uncertainty within the world provides an avenue for us to rethink It's not, and as I've said, there's nothing fits, no one fits, there's nothing that will fit everything. But I think it's contextualizing to see what is the opportunities to actually provide and shift the power to the communities in the most effective way so that the responses are also effective. Allow me to say maybe two extra things that I think from our perspective we've also seen. As RCIT, we continue to champion with states to build what we call those advisory mechanisms that sit at state level. They are a channel, a line of channel for communication with governments from a technical expertise. We have seen so far, I think 14 countries within the EXCOM members adopting some of these mechanisms. And I think I also like the point that Megan mentioned that it's not necessary that participation at the highest level is the most important or lowest is always. I think it's contextualizing what fits what and what would work best. But I think paramount for us to realize is that with the localization agenda, with the decolonization of aid, it will be, I think, something that is not right for our communities and for marginalized groups if they're not part and parcel for that future that they want. And in fact, when they say nothing for us without us, I usually argue that then if you go ahead to do something for marginalized groups like IDPs and the rest, then it's actually against their will and what they think for the future. And I think that engagement should be more of how do we get more representation from these groups? How do we utilize their skills? How do we change the perception within the larger context? How do we resource these groups? 1% of funding goes to local organizations. Some of them are IDP-led. Is this enough resources for the people that we call fast responders in the communities? The answer is no. So it demands a lot of restructuring, a lot of allyship that will be needed, and a change of mindset to actually make what will be, for me, the new world order in terms of how to center IDPs, refugees, and the rest of the marginalized groups into that discussion. So allow me to end there, but thank you very much for having me.
Ishimwe, I think you said it better than I could. I think we are at a unique moment, and I think we will see how things will unfold. But we are seeing drastic changes in the system, and I think this is the perfect time to be making this call for how we have an opportunity for change. Some of it has been thrust on us in a very negative way as we see funding cuts, as we see resources, but we do also see an opportunity for deeper and more meaningful power shifting with many of the recommendations that have been put forth in this panel, many of the practices and efforts that you all have spearheaded. We have a deep body of knowledge we can borrow from the refugee space. IDPs have developed many techniques and approaches. We do know that there are certain things that work well, but we do need to see drastic shift. And so I think you all have given us a lot to think about, a lot to really focus on what makes it meaningful, and a really important conversation. I know we're a few minutes over time. I feel like we could go for about 10 more hours, but we are due for a break, and I know it is late in the day for some. So we will have about a 10-minute break, and then others can come back. Please do come back for the next panel, which my colleague will be moderating. But I hope you'll all, wherever you are, applaud this panel with me, with gratitude for sharing their insights, their wisdom, and their dedication. Thank you so much for a really rich discussion, and we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the second panel of the conference today. This panel is entitled Rethinking Protection, Urban IDPs and Climate Change, and it's wonderful to see so many people still online, and hopefully a few more people will join us as well. I'm Kerry Holloway. I'm a research fellow with the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI Global, which is based in London, and I'll be moderating this panel. So we're all more than aware of the current humanitarian financing crisis that the sector currently faces, which began long before the cuts of the past months. In 2024, for example, the UN appealed for less money than it had in 2023 because the amount it received was already in decline. This trend continued again this year, with the UN again appealing for less for its global humanitarian overview than it did last year, even though the amount of need and suffering in the world has continued to increase. But it's exactly because of this trend that it's more important than ever that we concentrate on the types of interventions that have the greatest chance for success. While many would argue that in the current aid climate, humanitarians need to go back to basics and focus only on emergency life-saving needs rather than on something like livelihoods, I think this is short-sighted for two reasons. First, when faced with conflict, natural hazard-related disasters, or other slow-onset disasters wrought by a worsening climate, people who have the capacity to be resilient are less likely to need humanitarian assistance in the future. By focusing some attention on building resilience in those for whom it's possible, future humanitarian responses can be smaller and more targeted to those who are unable to help themselves. And second, in the 8 years that I've been doing humanitarian policy research, we've heard consistently that livelihood support is the type of assistance that displaced people desire most. So we'll start this panel through a dialogue with our distinguished panelists, followed by an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So please do continue to use the question function in Zoom at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions that you have while the panelists are speaking. And also, I think we still have the interpretation available for you, and hopefully someone will put that in the chat. So if you do need a different language, you can access it through the link that will be in the chat. So I now have the honor of introducing our panelist. Judy Baker is currently a senior advisor with Cities Alliance, adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and a consultant working on urban development issues internationally. Until 2023, she was the global lead economist for the World Bank in global practice in urban resilience and land. Throughout her 30-year career at the World Bank, she was responsible for leading policy dialogue, project management, and analytical work, covering topics related to urban inclusion, sustainable urbanization, affordable housing, service delivery, climate change, and livelihoods. She's published 6 books, as well as producing numerous country and regional reports for the World Bank. Isis Núñez Ferreira is a senior advisor on urban displacement and resilience with over 19 years of experience spanning both policy and programming across urban and development sectors. She's led strategic initiatives in more than 20 countries, including the development of the Urban Recovery Framework for Syria, the Community Engagement and Action Planning Model for Durable Solutions in Darfur, and urban recommendations and mayoral consultations for the UN High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement. She's worked with UN agencies, governments, civil society, and grassroots organizations to shape global policy and implement field-based solutions on urban recovery, food security, and livelihoods for IDPs. She was previously head of GIPS and urban lead at WFP and will be joining FAO in May. As she's currently between positions, she'll be speaking today in an independent capacity. Next, Jocelyn Perry is the senior advocate and program manager of the Climate Displacement Program at Refugees International. She has over a decade of experience working in advocacy, policymaking, research, and direct service on climate change with displaced populations, including managing a research theme on migration, urbanization, and climate change at the University of Pennsylvania's Global Public Policy Fund. Her doctoral research also focuses on stakeholder involvement in municipal climate adaptation planning. And finally, Farhad Shamarota is an Yazidi genocide survivor and the president of the Voice of the Yazidis, an organization that works on preventing and ending discrimination towards the Yazidi community. He's also an alumni fellow at Refugees International, as well as a PhD scholar in international politics, specializing in genocide studies. So we're going to run this panel as a series of questions between the panelists. And panelists, again, I'll just remind you, if you can try to keep your responses to about 3 minutes each, then hopefully we'll be able to get through quite a few questions. And just one more reminder to all the people who are tuning in, if you'd like to ask the panelist a question, please do use the question and answer function in Zoom. So I'll turn first to Judy. Judy, you've been working in the urban development sector on inclusive cities, including livelihoods and displacement for many years. So can you start us off by telling us a bit more about the trends that you've seen over this time?
Thank you. And sorry about all the movement. I just,
Oh,
I hope
Judy,
you
I'm
can,
having a bit of trouble hearing you. I don't know if I'm the only one.
can you hear me okay now?
No, I still can't hear you.
It's good for us.
It's okay?
Yes, yes, sorry. It was me.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Suddenly my one device wasn't working, but we managed to find a second solution. Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. This is like such an important topic, and in the current environment, it's become so complex, and so all the more reason to put a focus on it right now. So as mentioned, I come to this with a lot of background and experience, much of it from the World Bank, but increasingly now, since I am working with Cities Alliance, also from that lens. So two big points come to mind for me. First, I will say that the issue of IDPs is not necessarily new, but the scale and the pace of it is, which puts an enormous strain on cities. So, you know, in the middle of last year, an estimated 75 million people were internally displaced. To give some perspective, over time, that number was about 25 million in 2010. So that just gives you a sense of the growth. And the majority of these displaced persons are mostly displaced due to conflict and violence, as well as disasters. And we know that many of them end up in low and middle income countries that face enormous economic challenges already. A majority of these IDPs move to cities, particularly secondary cities and towns. And I've seen a little bit of a paradigm shift there too. Whereas in the development sphere, we used to always focus in on capital cities. Increasingly, there's a recognition that there's a need to focus in on secondary cities and towns, really as a priority for investments. And this, with all of these people coming to cities, there's a huge strain on the demand for housing, for infrastructure, for social services. And people often end up in informal settlements where conditions are already characterized by overcrowding, limited access to basic services, and exposure to natural hazards. So this is just increasingly putting a big emphasis on the need to invest in cities. And the second point I wanted to raise is around exactly that there has also been a shift in thinking about cities. So I think initially in early days of development, there was an idea to keep people in rural areas. But we know over time that urbanization has been good for development. This agglomeration of people in cities lowers the cost of providing services and gives better access to markets and generates jobs and new opportunities. And migration, including displacement, is a big part of that urbanization story. It can bring opportunities for cities to bring new labor and skills and entrepreneurship. And for migrants, including displaced, it means capital and skills accumulation. That being said, we can't minimize the special circumstances of IDPs coming to cities. And we know that it can be very difficult. People have gone through trauma, and the shock is a lot, and host communities aren't always welcoming. So I think it just puts us with a mixed story for these challenges, but it does point to an emerging understanding of what cities can do to plan for and accommodate IDPs through various programs, which I'll talk about later. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Judy. So I'll go to Isis next. Isis, you've worked in several urban displacement contexts. So you were helping to shape the urban approaches like the Urban Recovery Framework in Syria and global urban strategies for UN agencies such as WFP. So based on this experience at both global and local levels, what do you think it takes to make solutions from the start actually work? So especially for urban IDPs and livelihoods. Are we doing it, or what still needs to shift?
Thank you, Carrie. And thanks for inviting me to this important discussion. Let me start by saying that I will take a food security angle to this question, also because I didn't want it to be too broad, but actually use it with a concrete example. And this is based on the work that I've been doing for the past years, but also on research that I'm carrying out at the moment on the link between internal displacement and food security. And of course, food insecurity is often one of the first impacts of displacement and one of the most tangible ones, no? But particularly in cities, that takes a very different nature. That is not linked to agricultural livelihoods. It's not linked to you being able to grow your own food, but it's actually linked to many different systems. It's linked to the high prices, to the inflation. It's linked to housing, overcrowding, way that sometimes IDPs live and how that affects the way that you utilize your food. It exposes you to diseases and so on. So there is quite a very different dynamic that it takes in cities. And I want to say that up front. But most importantly, food insecurity here is not just a symptom, but it's also a sign that livelihoods have broken down or never had a chance to recover in the first place. So very important example to take when we talk about solutions from the start. Another reason why I want to take this angle as well, in something I wanted to say here, is because as part of the research that I'm doing, just to mention an example, out of the 15 countries that are priority countries for the action agenda in terms of the internal displacement, 13 of them are considered global food crisis, meaning that they have high levels of acute food insecurity. So we see a very clear link between this internal displacement context and then food security crisis as well. For me, that's a challenge. That's something that we need to understand better, but it's also an opportunity to use this big machine of food assistance to think already on solutions from the start through livelihoods. And I will explain why. When we narrow down into urban, before I say my 5 points, I want to mention another aspect of the research. For example, in Somalia, we find that IPC, which is the global standard to measure the severity of food security, has found that IPC5, which is the highest level of food insecurity, actually exists in some cities in Somalia. We're talking about famine conditions in IDPs, specifically living in cities. And that is very much linked as well to the livelihoods, to their capacity to actually being able to buy, not only grow their food, because it's very difficult to do so when you don't have the land for you, to actually the capacity that you can have to actually buy the food when you live in a city and you are displaced in a city. So that's just to say, if we're serious from solutions to think and act on solutions from the start, then we can't address food insecurity in a separate way from livelihoods. For me, this is the earliest window we have to build stability, especially in urban areas, where markets matter, jobs are scarce, and assistance is stretched. But at the same time, there are systems in place that we can leverage, especially local systems and municipal systems that we can leverage. So very quickly, 4 points that I want to make on solutions from the start in this case, after giving you that kind of framing, is that food assistance is a livelihood intervention. This is my personal opinion, if we treat it that way. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen in this space is that we separated food assistance from livelihoods as if they belong in different timelines when they're not, especially when we're talking about urban displacement, as I mentioned before in my background. And I have observed, for example, in urban safety nets programs that have focused on cash assistance, but have made the effort to use that cash assistance to strengthen the local systems in place, so that eventually people can move away from food assistance and cash assistance specifically into resilience building. But then there's a caveat. That transition is also tricky, and I will explain this later in my second part of my intervention, how that transition-ready approach is quite important for these solutions from the start discussion. And I don't think we're quite getting it right in many of the contexts that are affected by internal displacement. The second point I want to make is that urban IDPs must be targeted through adaptive and inclusive mechanisms. Another example I will use here is from Colombia, and Paula knows this very well. But there are, for example, migrants and IDPs that are using very specific type of housing in urban areas that are housing that is transitional, that is temporary. And because they live in that type of housing that from the outside, it looks like a resistant and proper housing, they are completely miscategorized in the social registry. And this is an invisibility that IDPs have. So they don't have access to any type of support through social services or access including to services that allows them to rebuild their livelihoods. And this, again, is something that we really need to think clearly, because in urban areas, it's much more difficult to understand these specific IDP vulnerabilities, even when they're living in what looks like a good housing. So we've been working, for example, with the local government to really try to adapt the social registries so that they don't not only not take into account IDPs, but actually miscategorize them just because they live in a certain type of housing that looks in one way, but it's actually temporary. We also need to understand skill sets in urban areas. Not only the ones that IDPs bring, which many times are agricultural based, but also the ones that they evolve over time. In some of the places where I work, you have in one same household, a part of the family that still keeps their agricultural based livelihoods and actually do pendular movements going back to rural areas sometimes on a seasonal basis. And you have on the other side, the same household, the younger generations that are growing up at the margins of the city, not quite sure know how to use their skills or even what skills to use to make a life for themselves. No, they are kind of trapped between the background of their family in terms of agriculture and then the future that they have in the city. So that's another aspect that I think is important here as well. The other one, which I think I think Yuri will make a point later on as well, is that secondary cities are quite crucial for solutions from the start, but they're also under-resourced and overlooked sometimes in these discussions. From the food security perspective, I've been studying the secondary cities. The role of secondary cities in the food systems is quite crucial. And then when I look at it from the displacement perspective, it's also crucial as well. And what I mean is that cities are often closer to people's rural origins. Secondary cities are usually more affordable, are less politically congested than the capitals. At the same time, there are continuity zones. There are continuity zones for the food systems, and there are continuity zones for people that are being displaced or also people that are migrating for other reasons. And I think that interlinkage is quite interesting and is also an opportunity, but not quite understood. But I know that there are good interventions already, and I'm sure Judy will touch upon this point later on. Finally, and I want to say this, I know I'm taking quite a lot of time, Carrie. I will make my next intervention shorter, but I think it's quite important to say this because it's a reality check. I think it's important to also ground livelihoods in conflict-sensitive and peace-oriented strategies. Many of the IDP contexts that require most of this approach are also highly insecure, have very fundamental access constraints, especially for the most vulnerable IDPs. And it is here where livelihoods programs can support peace, but at the same time require a broader lens. Here we need to talk about rule of law, we need to talk about humanitarian dialogue, things that are a bit beyond livelihoods, but we shouldn't necessarily see them as separate. I'm talking an example that I'm familiar with, for example, in Northeast Nigeria, where there has been the clear effort to move from humanitarian assistance into livelihoods and more sustainable programming. But what happens? That every now and then there are security concerns and other type of concerns that basically regress a lot of the resilience that is built. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do livelihoods programming. It means that we need to take a more systemic approach to how we design them, area-based approaches, but especially also support systems like the rule of law and other aspects that are more into our peace component of durable solutions. I think it's possible, but we need to also talk more about that and find more practical ways to implement them. So I'll stop there, and I hope in my next intervention I can also mention all that.
It's fine, no worries. That was all really interesting, and it's I think really good grounding, both you and Judy, for the panel that we have today. So I'll go next to Farhad. So Isis has given us a lot of local examples, and I'm hoping you'll do the same as well. So how do you see these trends that both Judy and Isis have described playing out on the local level in Iraq? And what are the changes in emphasis and funding that you've seen over the past, well, decade really of working with the Yazidi population there?
Well, thank you. I think my colleague just gave me you showed me the gate to what I would like to say, when you mentioned the conflict and peace building approach. And speaking of the Yazidi genocide survivor who are internally displaced, just for those who are not very familiar, back in 2014, the so-called Islamic State started its genocidal campaign in Shingal region in Syria, border of Iraq. Yeah, and majority of Yazidi community were displaced within Sinjar community, within Sinjar region, to the top of Sinjar mountain, or to the northern of Iraq, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, or KRI. Yeah, remembering when in 2000, like I think was 17 August, when we survived the genocide, went through Syria and camp, and we just faced the UNHCR team were there, and we were like hundreds and thousands of people, and it was really harsh time of summer, like the almost 50 degrees of Celsius, and this of course gives an example how the rising heat average in Iraq is like really alarming, but I will not speak about that, since speaking about the survival at the beginning of the genocide. However, yeah, we hoped, and people like me, I was like very active. I started to help the tents to be settled. I wished to be temporary. But 10 years on, still we have these camps are there. Sometimes our people ask for their tents to be changed because they have become very old and cannot stand anymore. So we have been repeating, changing tents each few years. A decade of displacement, it was really like the humanitarian relief people were there. And WHO was there, UNHCR were there, local authorities were there. But none of them in 10 years have emphasized on why these people been here 10 years. Like, where is the solution? Where is the conflict? So the region is still a conflict field and a ground field of the many militias, armed groups, Turkish airstrikes, which make it complicated for people to return back. However, just to say, Yazidi genocide survivors have been left in limbo between the inadequacy of local authorities of finding solution for their homeland and the inadequacy of international community in actually putting into efforts finding solution. But I would also say, maybe in my next intervention, I can emphasize more. I'm sad to say, but the complicity of international organizations who stayed silent on letting, like we just see our children are growing up in tents. Last statistic we have 70,000 kids in first 5 years were newly born in camps. I could, of course, speak about the health issues in the camps, the dramatic and shocking number of suicidal cases, loss of lives, spread of diseases. All these aspects are present there. But yeah, we haven't seen any effective approach on finding solution, but actually just keeping this almost majority of Yazidi community in a survival mood for a decade now. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Farhad. That's a really powerful example, I think, of when things don't really move forward. I'm going to turn to Jocelyn, who hopefully will have some answers for that and for the IDP situations in other places in the world. So Jocelyn, when you're thinking about how cities can adapt and adjust to the arrival of IDPs, so very much in the way that maybe the Yazidi community has not been adapted to or adjusted and made inclusive within a city, what can cities actually do? What can we be thinking about to help people get back on their feet, to rebuild their lives, to integrate, to stop living in limbo, basically, and to integrate into cities better?
Thank you so much. And thanks to all the other panelists for being here today too. I think that the first piece that I think of is layering climate into this, which is that regardless of the reason that people are moving to cities, whether it's displacement due to the impacts of climate change, displacement due to educational opportunities or livelihoods, or due to violence or political instability. And often these reasons and more are all tangled together in people's individual and community decisions to migrate, whether that's from the rural areas to urban areas, whether that's from a secondary city to a capital city, or from a country to another country. We're thinking of welcoming infrastructure for those cities, for people to be arriving and welcomed by communities and by the governments that are in those cities, regardless of the reasons for which people are moving. And we talk about climate and climate displacement or climate mobility as if it's a new phenomenon sometimes, but realistically, we know urbanization has happened for centuries as well. We've had industrialization where people have been moving from rural agricultural-based livelihoods to urban industrialized livelihoods, which has also contributed to climate change. So regardless of climate change, this industrialization process has happened and has contributed to people moving to cities. People also, due to the political instability or due to violence or due to these many other factors that I mentioned, might be moving to cities. And so cities need to be prepared for this regardless of the reasons for which people are arriving. And the answer to that is basic urban planning to start out with. Like, we know a lot of the solutions to making cities better for people that live in them. We know how to build safe and affordable housing. We know how to build efficient, affordable transportation. We know we need access to sufficient educational opportunities, healthcare facilities, all of the needs for someone to get through their daily life, for their communities to be healthy and happy and to be able to afford to live there. We don't always do these things for a variety of reasons, but the sort of know-how of how to accomplish them is there and is partly a matter of financing and partly a matter of political will in order to achieve them. But then we do layer climate on top of that, and that brings in a host of other needs to make sure that people are being adaptive and resilient to climate change, to the current hazards or risks that they're facing, as well as ones that will be new or worsened as climate change worsens in the future. So for people moving into a city, for example, that might mean taking into consideration where floodplains are and not building there or not moving into those areas. For cities to be building better drainage systems, for example, or homes that are more resilient. So maybe moving away from tin roofs that trap heat in places that face extreme heat. So those are sort of government-led interventions. The government needs to be taking those into consideration. At an organizational level, we work with, say, organizations that might support IDPs in finding housing as they're moving into a city. And what those organizations need to be doing is either working with the city or working with people who have access to data on, say, where floodplains are, where they're going to worsen, to be taking into consideration the safety of housing that they might be suggesting to people to move into. So that might mean as people move into cities, they're often living on the outskirts, as Cisse was mentioning. These might be on a hill. If that hill is subject to flooding or increased risk to mudslide, those people are at increased climatic risk. And what we need to be doing is making sure that there are accessible neighborhoods that aren't at that increased risk. It is easier in some ways to be responding to climate change than other displacement hazards because it's predictable, though. So we know to an extent how bad climate change is going to be, what impacts that's going to cause, and we can model where people are going to move from and to. And so this can actually help cities prepare on these 5-year, 10-year timescales that we need for major infrastructure projects, as well as social infrastructure, building out the number of places in schools and healthcare, in jobs for the people that are arriving, building out skills training programs, things like that, social infrastructure. And so using that data and that modeling of both the climatic impacts as well as the mobility impacts, cities can use that basic urban planning knowledge to then prepare for the arrival of X number of people by Y year. And then also for that movement, that sort of reciprocal movement between communities, maybe people moving from urban areas and back to urban areas and to rural areas. That could be circular, it could be seasonal migration due to crop seasons. That can also support rural areas to be making decisions about survival and maintenance of livelihoods for the people that do stay in those areas, access to services as people move away, safety in the wake of worsening climate impacts in rural areas as well. So we need to be building out that climate resilient infrastructure, as well as the sort of social or soft infrastructure in terms of knowledge, preparedness for storms, preparedness for heat waves, and making sure that people have access to resources, information, and sufficient finance to actually follow those best practices. So I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thanks, Dawson. I think you've given us a lot of information about what should be happening, but I have a feeling that probably this isn't happening. And I want to go back to Farhad because I feel like you mentioned some of this or kind of alluded to some of this in your first intervention. So you mentioned, I just want to pick up on a few things. For one, you mentioned it being 50 degrees Celsius, and Jocelyn's just talked a lot about how we need to incorporate climate sensitive approaches into our interventions. And then the other thing I wanted to pick up on is Jocelyn talked a lot about things that we should be doing, but don't always do due to financing or political will. And in your earlier intervention, you kind of alluded to this idea that NGOs and the international community aren't doing enough. And so I just want to go back to you and give you an opportunity to maybe expand on that point. How have NGOs and the international community been supporting the Yazidi population in Iraq? Or perhaps maybe a better question is, how haven't they?
Well, thank you. If I'm allowed, I would just critically call them NGO complex industry. I mean, I don't want to be ignorant that I know a lot of our colleagues and NGOs that they have people that really willing and they were providing life-saving support. And this was crucial at the first steps of the genocide. But 10 years on, for like people who are committed and speak up for this community that is facing an existential struggle. Thousands are crossing borders, risking their life. Others are growing up in the camps, and their homeland remain a battlefield for different armed groups. I would just say that the NGO have just maintained the status quo that was perpetrated by the local authorities, and such situation like leaving people 10 years and flooding all these millions of dollars into the local economy through supporting IDPs, workshops, a lot of projects. Like we're speaking about millions of dollars to the camps that every month for the NGOs, that could have been planned differently. So what I really wish, and I think is the wish of the Yazidi community, that the next decade will not be the same approach. And I'm glad, I think Paula is here that's listening to this. The 10 coming years, there should be different dealing with Yazidi genocide survivors. Camps are not the solution, neither for healing, neither for health, neither for the climate, for nothing. But they were temporary solution as life-saving approach. Maybe for a few months, for 1 year, 2 years, not for a decade on. Now we are almost 11 years old, 11 years after the genocide. Therefore, those organizations, either they should really at least recommend that, okay, we don't think this is a solution. Of course, I know it goes outside their mandates many times to speak about, but this is Islamic State, ISIS have planned to destroy this community. And they really intended to mass displace this community. And our support as organizations to maintain that statue is definitely just helping the terrorists to complete and achieve their approach on us. That is what I don't think anyone intend to help terrorists to achieve their approach. But we just need to realize and reflect deeply what we have left behind and look forward for some meaningful solution for these people in the camps. United Nations should play big role in actually monitoring and realistically truth-based approach to show what is really going on after 10 years. The hatred, and one term I would like to mention, Yazidi community would always say we are still in an ongoing genocide, because the consequence of this genocide is still on, and international community have failed to put any prevention measures for further atrocities. Just last year, in back 2023, even Secretary General the UN Secretary General have mentioned that Yazidi community facing hate speech campaign in Iraq and Kurdistan region, fearing another atrocity may happen anytime. Back in 2024, 2,000 family displaced back to Sinjar against their will, fearing another genocide campaign can happen. So there has been no conflict, have been no trust building, no peace building approach that can. And this is all rooted in one big issue that I would always speak it up. Because the international community, United Nations, international organization, Iraqi authorities, KRG authorities, all involved, all those who promised and give us thousands of promises to protect us, keep us our homeland safe in aftermath of this genocide. They have not listened to Yazidi genocide survivor. They've been listening to others on behalf of us. So my message to everyone who willing to support, do not do things for us without us, such as what United Nations and United States of America also helped in creation of Sinjar Agreement, which basically strategically returning us back into a day before genocide. Is that a solution? We don't want that. So in that base, we have a voice to reject things and try to unify our voice to demand for solution. We need you. I'm critical because we are in pain. We are facing an existential struggle. We are in need. We need your help. We need you to come, but come listen to us and just understand us. If you don't listen to people who are actually targeted and experiencing, and that you will not be able to put out solution out there. I want to thank you on this. Of course, we are always grateful and appreciative of all these organizations. I have worked with many of them, in the ground with United Nations. I was volunteering for UNHCR, settling the tents. So it doesn't mean we consider ourselves a part of all this effort. It is important and I admire, we are thankful. But many things have been wrong and we want to correct that in a right direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Farhad. I think a lot of what you just said comes back to the first panel we had today on IDP participation. So for those of you who might be online who missed that one, there will be a recording later if you're interested in more of what Farhad was just talking about in terms of how to get IDPs to participate more fully. Issa, so I'm going to go back to you because you've had quite a career with the UN, and Farhad was just critical to some extent with some of the stuff that's happened, but you've been in quite a lot of different contexts as well across the world. You've helped shape global strategies and you've also worked with field level programming. So as Farhad was saying, in Iraq, it doesn't sound like we've made this shift from response to resilience for IDPs there, but what have you seen in the rest of the world? Have we been able to make this shift from just responding, from maybe preserving that status quo, as he's mentioning, towards resilience, where IDPs, particularly urban IDPs, can get back on their feet and really support themselves?
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Farhad, for also preempting a bit this discussion with your intervention. I think we made progress in how we talk about resilience. I've seen really forward-looking frameworks looking at resilience of people, of communities, of systems. I've seen those frameworks in many of the organizations that I worked or that I have researched. But when it comes to urban IDPs and livelihoods, I think the shift still has a way to go. Because IDPs in many cases in organizations are seen as beneficiaries of humanitarian assistance, first and foremost, livelihoods are seen as the next phase. Not necessarily a core component of the assistance from the beginning, and therefore of the solution that should be thought about from the very beginning. But in urban contexts, where jobs are informal, where services are overwhelmed, where housing is insecure, you can't stabilize lives. You can't bring back dignity into people's life without rebuilding incomes and allowing people to have livelihoods to live their lives and provide for their families. So the 2-3 points I want to make around this and why we haven't made the shift or what we need to do about it. One of the very practical, but I think it's also policy relevant aspects that I've seen is that this transition from response to resilience building activities, whether it's livelihoods or other type of resilience building activities, is seen as an individual or household journey. But it's systemic, it's fundamentally systemic, especially in urban areas. You can't rebuild a livelihood in a sustainable long-term way if you're not embedding this into at least a few systems in that city that can carry it out in the long term, whether you're talking about social protection systems, whether you're talking about contingency planning, climate adaptation plans, you need to embed it somewhere that protects what you're gaining in terms of resilience as an IDP household, as an IDP person. You can't do that without attaching it to a system or to systems in place in cities. And I think that's a bit of a problem when we talk about these transitions words that I'm using here. We see it as an individual outcome or as a household outcome, as a journey that is just about the individual and the household, but is the responsibility of so many other people and systems in place. So transitions are not being made in a systemic way, and they're still very fragile. We're bringing here the climate aspect of this. If you are building livelihoods in an urban area that is also prone to different types of climate shocks, it's for sure these same people will be affected by climate shocks, if not now, in the medium term or in the long term. And what is going to happen then if these livelihoods are not also entrenched into a broader and more into a stronger kind of a strategy? These people will regress and we go back to previous vulnerable levels, or even worse, we have then cases of secondary and tertiary displacement that just puts IDPs into more vulnerable situations every time that they get displaced. So I think that lack of systemic approach to transitions is not a program activity, it's really a systemic effort, and especially that should be ingrained into government systems whenever it's possible. If we don't do that, I don't see this shift really being not only not happening, but being sustainable in the long term. The second point I want to make is that we don't need only a systemic approach, we also need a prevention mindset, especially when we bring climate into play, into the discussion. We can have a very nice systemic approach. We can have government leadership and ownership of some of these strategies. We can have a social protection system that is inclusive of IDPs and categorize them in the right way based on their displacement-related vulnerabilities. But if we are not putting the systems in place to prevent bigger catastrophes coming from climate shocks that will come eventually and will keep coming, then we are also at the risk of eroding that resilience again. And I'm talking here both from the displacement angle, but also from climate resilience angle. We need early warning systems that are inclusive of IDPs, but also scientifically and practically sound. We need also contingency planning that is sensitive not only to displacement, but also to urban. I've been involved also in interventions where contingency planning and protocols were designed at the national level and applied in that way for the urban without taking into account the specific urban conditions of those specific cities, whether they're capital or secondary or smaller towns. So I think that's also another important angle that needs to be displacement sensitive, but also urban sensitive in this case. So that prevention mindset is quite important. And again, here I mentioned, because we see more and more secondary and tertiary displacement eroding resilience, the very little resilience that sometimes people can build, IDPs can build over time. And I think here prevention is quite important. I haven't even touched upon the conflict aspect of prevention. That's for another discussion, but I think I wanted to put here the seed of the prevention discussion. The third point I want to make is that urban displacement, urban livelihoods requires urban tools. And I know this is logical. Maybe for us, we all know each other and have worked in this area. So for us, it's logical, but we're still treating many of these topics with a rural lens. I bring the food security aspect because I had to draft the urban strategy for one of the UN agencies. And one of the first challenges that we all agree upon is that our tools and our way of measuring, for example, food security, but we can talk about poverty as well, sometimes is rural-centric. We don't take into account the difficulties of people living in urban areas and the complexities of measuring in an urban area. Imagine bringing the IDP angle into this. It becomes even more complex, but we need to acknowledge it and we need to address it. So we need urban tools, we need urban lens, and the great thing it is that we have such a long tradition of urban planning, of urban theory, of so many tools that we can use, but we need to acknowledge that we actually need them and then applying it instead of using rural templates for livelihoods or for other topics, especially when it comes to IDPs. So I think the urban lens is very important here. So what do we need to do differently based on some of these challenges? I think we said this before, but I put this again. We need to align humanitarian development actors from the start, not in sequence. It's not one after the other, but in partnership. There's a lot of ledgering that needs to happen. And with this is also a different type of funding that needs to happen, because I've seen it firsthand how country offices, country teams really try to make this transition, really try to make this ledgering, but it's impossible with the type of funding that is received. So this is an important aspect as well, and practical aspect. So these funding transitions as a process and not a project, not a program activity. This is a process and it needs to be systemic. So this also applies for the funding, but also for the approach that we take. And lastly, work with municipalities and local economies and being sensitive to the urban lens that we need to apply in these cases. I'll stop there, and thanks so much.
Great, thanks. And Judy, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Cisse just said. I also know you've been working with Cities Alliance, which is implementing programs with municipal governments in the Horn of Africa. So has some of these things that Cisse just touched on, have you seen them to be effective? And what has your experience been in working with these municipal governments? I think most of them are secondary cities or towns rather than capital cities as well.
Yeah, thank you. So indeed, you can't do any of this without working with local governments. The idea, in fact, of course, is to get people out of camps and have them mainstreamed in the economy and in the city and have access to housing and services. So, of course, you have to work closely with local governments. And you know, we have, again, there's a lot of knowledge and experience in doing that. One of the big challenges, I think, that I have found is, you know, when you work with secondary cities, where again, a lot of IDPs are, you know, the capacity tends to be a little bit weaker because they don't have the same resources that you would have in a capital city. and they have fewer both financial and human resources. So it is a little bit of a challenge. So that is where the focus of a lot of Cities Alliance work is in secondary cities and towns. And there are several programs I wanted to highlight. Just again, very, very superficial view of it, but there's certainly a lot of information that you can find on the website about some of these programs or get in touch. But these are, directing support at city-led initiatives to promote inclusion, especially of migrants and forcibly displaced populations in the urban economies, and allow and facilitate access to public services. So in last year, in 2024, alongside SDC funding, there was work in 22 cities across East Africa, Tunisia, Guatemala, and a newly launched program in the Mekong, in Cambodia and Thailand border with Myanmar. And that focuses really on strengthening economic corridors for improved jobs and services, again, working with local governments. There's also a very important program that Cities Alliance is implementing, funded by the EU, in working to strengthen the migration, governance, and urban resilience in 9 cities in the Horn of Africa, in the DRC, Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, and Uganda. And together, with these efforts, are really focusing on better integrating displaced populations and fostering inclusive and resilient cities and social inclusion, a lot of things that we've heard about. So the programs focus on working with local authorities, providing technical assistance to manage, this mobility, and emphasizing community inclusion, helping to integrate displaced communities, and it's drawing quite a bit on some work that was done previously in the Horn of Africa that was like a knowledge sharing across cities, which is something I think is super important, because we know, I've worked, with national governments, local governments, we know that cities learn from each other. They always say national governments, talk and cities act. So it's really important to have this city to city knowledge exchange. Then using this livelihoods perspective, is an interesting example. We were talking about this corridor in Ethiopia, the Borrero corridor, where there's a focus on helping with job matching, with skills development, business incubation, and engagement of the diaspora for local investments, and working with local governments on the broader job creation and public services environment. So, a real focus on the livelihoods piece. And this also includes a cooperation with specific women's groups, and, big component on gender sensitive activities. And then, we were talking before about some of the climate impacts Jocelyn had mentioned. There's sort of all of the employment that is linked to solid waste management. So, for example, Cities Alliance is helping to integrate informal waste pickers into a profitable recycling chain through co-ops and working with the private sector. And they've provided business and financial training for small entrepreneurs. So there's a lot happening in that space. And then finally, on the investment side, I also wanted to mention or highlight the importance of market spaces. So this is really important, especially, when people come in, there's a low barrier of entry, and it's created a lot of working in markets, small scale trading, and it's created a lot of livelihood opportunities for IDPs. So the investments come at creating these spaces, making sure that there is water and sanitation and accessibility and enough lighting and safety, so that people can participate in the markets and have a place to go to sell and buy their goods and services. And there's some evidence that's coming out about just how impactful these investments are, and so it's been replicated in multiple cities. So I'll stop there, but just to give you a flavor about some of the activities in working with secondary cities to help promote livelihoods and integrate IDPs. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Judy. And just to say, if you do have any additional questions for any of the panelists, please do use the Q&A function in the chat. I know quite a few of them have touched on some really big issues that they didn't get to dig too far into. So if there is anything else that you want to hear more about, please do let us know. We've got one more question for Jocelyn, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. So Jocelyn, the last question for you, it's quite a big one. We've touched on funding a few times in this panel. I touched on it in the opening, and a few of the speakers have also touched on it, whether in terms of the lack of funding being the reason that things haven't necessarily changed, but also in terms of the funding structures between humanitarian and development actors being the reason why that layering doesn't necessarily occur. And then also a lot of these projects and everything, it takes money, right? And most of the countries in which you've got these large displacement contexts aren't the wealthiest. So they're looking for other alternatives, and yet the humanitarian funding landscape and the development funding landscape is pretty bleak right now. So what have been the impact of the funding cuts we've seen this year? And are there any glimmers of hope in the possibility of finding more funding for IDP context in untraditional places? So lots has been thrown around about the Loss and Damage Fund, for example, but is that just a, kind of a hope in the distance, or is it something that might actually happen?
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, and of course, all of our conversations today are happening in this crisis of humanitarian funding due to cuts to U.S. aid, but also due to the ongoing scarcity that the development and humanitarian worlds have been operating in for years, as well as other partners, countries outside the United States, following suit, needing to reallocate budgets to other priorities and reducing humanitarian aid aligned with the US completely destroying its US AID infrastructure. So the big picture from data that we've seen so far, in terms of initial analysis we've done at Refugees International, at least, of terminated USAID grants, shows that over $2.1 billion in funding that was allocated to grants that included climate programming have been terminated, with just $36 million in funding for any other activities, including climate, remaining after the initial round of terminations. So doing quick math on that, we saw over 98% of the awards that included climate elements in their grant descriptions were terminated, which is higher than sort of the average across the board of US aid terminations, because they sort of prioritized or kept ones that prioritized life-saving assistance, so to speak. But I would argue, and I think many in our community would argue, that the grants that were preparing communities for disasters, the grants that were supporting agricultural technology and transformation to improve climate resilience are providing life-saving assistance, that we see people dying unnecessarily every day from preventable impacts of climate worsened disasters, whether that's waterborne diseases that floodwaters are carrying through communities without sufficient wash infrastructure, from malnutrition and starvation made worse from crop failures due to climate change, just from the impacts of storms, all of which USAID funding was working to fix systematically to help countries build their infrastructure to improve all of these systems to prevent future impacts, rather than just the immediate food assistance, disaster recovery, medical support that we often hear about with USAID programs. And we also know that this funding is a strong investment economically. Research shows that for every dollar invested in disaster preparedness or climate resilience, we save $3 to $10 in disaster response. We're also hearing from partners around the world that cuts to non-climate programs, so medical assistance, emergency food aid, the like, also are seriously impacting people's climate resilience. Because when you cut those essential services, provision of HIV/AIDS medication, for example, people have to reallocate money from their family budgets, if they have any, to now meet that immediate need, or to buy food that they were getting through emergency food aid before. And by fulfilling these basic survival needs, which they have to do, they no longer have maybe that little extra money in their budget for the month to make their home safer in response to a storm, or to invest in a slightly better seed that they're going to plant that's going to be more resilient to climate change. And so we're going to see longer term impacts where people are going to be less resilient and less able to survive future climatic effects because of this reallocation of resources that they're being forced to do due to cuts to emergency assistance. So this is making people more vulnerable both to climate change, but also to displacement, that if they can't meet their immediate needs, or if they're unsafe in their homes and communities, they might be displaced as a result, which could be redisplacement or repeat displacement for IDPs or others who are living in displacement already. And what these programs look like kind of on a more granular level could be anything from preventing deforestation, planting trees, which, supports climate mitigation, meaning we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but also really within communities, the immediate effects is that trees' roots prevent the washing away of topsoil, so it's preventing mudslides, it's helping to keep water in the ground, reducing the effects of drought, keeping communities safer. There are also projects that help to maintain forest cover by promoting things like cleaner cook stoves, which use less fuel, reduce deforestation because of that, but also burn cleaner, so they're better for people's health in the immediate term. And then the final piece is other livelihood activities that have been cut. So transitioning people away from subsistence agriculture to provide other opportunities. So if you have drought, if you have crop failure, people are not just reliant on that, but have other methods of income. And the cuts have just wasted an enormous amount of money here, because if we're investing in these alternative livelihoods, and then we cut those programs without any notice for people to plan on those investments, to plan what they needed to transition to maintaining those livelihood opportunities, they are no longer able to maybe maintain them, to keep investing in those businesses, because they had just no notice that they were going to be losing the funding for those programs. All of which is just really depressing and awful, and the world that we're existing in. But you're asking about glimmers of hope too. So I'm going to get into the UN climate change architecture, which includes the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. And that was a new institution adopted a couple of years ago at COP28 in Dubai, and is now being fully operationalized. And this came after decades of civil society mobilization to get this fund in place. And what it means when we talk about loss and damage in the climate world, that means the negative impacts of climate change that are already happening. So things that we're not able to adapt to or to mitigate, we are facing the loss and damage. And that could be the wholesale loss of small island states, or that could be loss of your crops, loss of your home, other impacts from climate change. And so the fund is meant to, though not explicitly, compensate communities for these losses. And just last week, actually, so a few days ago, the board of the fund met in Barbados to operationalize the startup phase of the fund. So not years in the future, but in 2025 and 2026, the fund said it's going to distribute $250 million in the form of grants to communities facing the impacts of climate change. So each grant will be in the range of $5 million to $20 million. And at least 50% of this will be allocated to small island developing states and least developed countries. So these are the countries facing the first impacts of climate change, as small island states sometimes lose their entire territories, maybe in the long term, and have the fewest resources to respond in the case of least developed countries. They've also highlighted they're going to support bottom-up country-led approaches, including building national responses that will include the effective engagement of all relevant stakeholders, including climate vulnerable communities in particular. So among these communities, we would argue are IDPs, displaced persons, refugees, and that those individuals need to have access to this funding and need to be consulted in its distribution and allocation. And so I would say the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage is intended for getting assistance directly to communities who need these funds the most, and epitomizes what we need to be doing. Enshrined in it is community access to the fund. So while that won't be the case directly in this startup phase. If this fund, which is hosted by the World Bank, can do this well and can do this eventually, where funding's going from the World Bank to community-led organizations, then that could be something that we learn from in the case of other funds. But we definitely need, and kind of echoing back to our morning panel, across the board participation in these processes by leaders from affected communities themselves. The other opportunity for funding more broadly is that if displaced communities are included in national adaptation plans, for example, which countries use to decide how they're going to adapt to climate change, those plans are funded by any number of multilateral donor funds as well as bilateral donors. And that could include and open opportunities for those communities to receive funding from those individuals. There's also a number of recommendations for donor coordination, for learning across the board from donors, as well as from city-to-city knowledge exchange that Judy was mentioning. But given US withdrawal from the UNFCCC institutions, it's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, including the board of the Fund for Loss and Damage, we need really robust commitments from other parties, from other countries that are on these boards, to ensure that these new institutions, which are quite fragile, still haven't been fully operationalized, still don't have that institutional knowledge, to make sure that we have commitments to fund these institutions and to make sure they're strong enough to respond to the climate crisis and other crises we're facing, and that they're centering affected communities, including displaced people who are some of the most climate vulnerable. So I'll leave it there with that call. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jocelyn. And we've actually just had a question come through the chat asking about filling gaps for funding, which I think you've answered quite a lot of, but just throwing it out there in case anyone else on the panel has any ideas about how do we fill these gaps that have now appeared. We've got two other questions that have been submitted. I'm going to ask them both. One is for Judy specifically, and the other one I think is just kind of open to everyone. So Judy, the one that's to you is if you could elaborate a bit on how the diaspora is helping support livelihoods for displaced people in the Horn of Africa. So how is Cities Alliance working with diaspora communities to help promote self-reliance among those who are displaced? And then the other question that's come in is around how can researchers investigating the health needs of IDPs who are in the midst of armed conflicts ensure accurate data collection? I don't know if anyone on this panel has knowledge of that, but just thought I'd throw it out there in case anyone did. So I'll go to Judy first, because I think yours might be a bit easier, and then I'll come back. And if anyone else wants to tackle that other question about how to accurately collect data in the midst of armed conflicts with IDPs, we can finish with that one. So Judy, over to you.
Thank you. So I don't have a ton of information on it, but I certainly can get it. What I will say is that often it's just an information gap, right? That, there's a diaspora that wants to help, that wants to invest, that wants to, provide support, and they don't always know how to make that happen. So other organizations can play a really, really important facilitation role by identifying, who's in need and what those needs look like, and then on the implementation side. And so just connecting the two is really a critical role. But in terms of like this, details about how it works, I'll have to get back to you. So hopefully we can just park that for now. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Judy. And anyone else want to take a stab at the other question around how researchers can ensure accurate data collection for IDPs in the midst of armed conflicts? I mean, I think accurate data collection, even not in the midst of armed conflicts, is probably quite difficult itself, much less in the midst. But Isis, you look like you're ready to say something, so why don't you go ahead?
Yes, not sure if I'll be able to respond to the whole question, but I can give an example. Because of course, WFP, where I was working until recently, works in areas of active conflict, and I want to mention the huge efforts of the DRC country office, the Democratic Republic of Congo office, that have a huge challenge in understanding the situation of IDPs, as I think all of you know the dynamic situation that is happening there. And even though they are one of the country offices that have have invested the most in IDP, in data disaggregated for IDPs to understand their situations. This is not an easy task. It's a mix. It really requires a multi-source approach, the use of technology, the use of mobile data, and finding it's just using any source that links you to IDPs and their movements and their situations, and then using a triangulation across all those different type of sources. But it's really using a multi-source approach. Of course, you use quantitative data and surveys whenever possible. But one thing that has been fundamental in that approach has been also the connection with local organizations and being able to work with them and local institutions, even the National Institute of Statistics. All of that has been brought together to try to find in always possible information about IDPs, whether they are in return areas that are inaccessible but highly vulnerable, or in camps and informal sites as well. And actually, we're going to be publishing in May the Global Report on Food Crisis that will have a specific chapter on displacement. And we actually wrote a case study on DRC and with the insights that we managed to collect, specific about IDPs, but also with gender differences, as well as differences by location, which is also very important. We could also see how vulnerabilities among IDPs change based on where they were located, whether in camps, in informal sites, or hosted by families as well. So just to mention the huge efforts that are being made in such a complex environment. It is possible, and you cannot get the full picture, but you can get enough to be able to have a good response for IDPs. But you do have to bring multiple sources of data together and rely on technology and other sources as well.
Great, thank you. Farhad, do you have any final thoughts before we close out the panel? And then Dawson, I'll come to you next for final thoughts. So just so you can prepare for a second.
Well, I would just say, I mean, I think maybe just building on the answers that have been given to these questions, I would invite researchers and data platforms and everyone, and those, let's say, academic or advocate, investigator on different situation in armed conflict, either it's about health or not about health. We should really ask ourselves, okay, I saw the question about the gap of funding, example of Ethiopia. Why don't we just ask ourselves to what extent we will be able to reach to the point that we will not struggle and fight to get this funding because we will not need it? To what extent we can really reduce, at least in a certain, like, I see a lot of effort being put into getting fundings, but less effort have been put on actually to work on reducing the need of that funding. So this will be like really an approach for researchers, for advocates to take. And of course, we're getting back to the root of the conflicts and the issues. And I think the climate and the armed conflict are really interconnected. Like given to the example of Shingal, I see like some region of our regions is getting like desert, like the plant are not there anymore. And this was the areas we were depending even on underground water, and we're planting like huge area every summer, cultivating tomatoes, cucumbers, other products, just to survive as source of life with all the agriculture things, even animal product and the plant product. But now when this conflict came, people left this region. So the region left like, I see like the wave of sand is getting onto the edge of Sanjar Mountain, while a few years ago, that region was green in the summer, like fully green. So this is interconnected, the both topics. I'm not expert on climate one, but I think if we put more effort on prevention and stopping the conflict, I'm sure we will be able to help our folks in the climate fight. Yeah.
Great, and Jocelyn, you've got the last word.
Thank you so much. I think the main thing that I'll highlight, following on to Farhad's interconnected point, is that we've had these crises within the humanitarian community that we haven't been addressing, that we've had difficulty resolving, that we haven't known the best way to support displaced populations ever. And we've tried to align humanitarian funding and planning timelines and work with development funding. And we haven't achieved that successfully either. And I think climate needs to be layered and adds another complexity to all of that. But those issues are all interconnected. We need climate adaptation and resilience for every population, which links to development and well-being, which links to preventing displacement or supporting people who are displaced to live safely where they currently are, where they move in the future, or if they're able to return home. So I think that these challenges, sometimes people hear climate and think this is something that's brand new, but really it's just a continuation and adds a layer of complexity, but also adds all of these resources and additional data and funding opportunities. So we need to be linking these communities more strongly, but following the same principles and lessons we've learned from many decades past of this work. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jocelyn. And I hope everyone online will join me in thanking the entire panel for the insights they've given today, which I found to be really fascinating, and I hope you all did as well. I now have the honor of handing it back to Paula to close out this session today. Paula, over to you.
Thank you, Carrie, very, very much. And thank you, all the speakers of this last panel. It is a privilege to be here and to have listened to all of you this morning. And to the organizers again, Refugees International, Georgetown University, ODI, and I'm turning my camera on. I forgot to turn it on. ODI, and for bringing us all together in this important, very important discussion. Thank to all the participants for your active engagement and for sharing ideas and expertise on tackling the most challenging issues on IDP participation. So we had two panels. The first one focused on how to make a true breakthrough on meaningful IDP participation, which is a priority of the mandate I lead. And we heard from the powerful and very experienced Yana that IDP leaders from different countries have come together and have developed recommendations to improve protection of internally displaced persons. And as we reiterated here today, this is the first time this has been done at the global level, and we need to give these recommendations attention and visibility. So if participation is the ability to influence, as Yana reminded us from the workshop in McGill, I agree that those of us that have the opportunity to raise our voices and ask for more accountability, as Megan reiterated, we should do more. So this conference today is just an example of those conversations that we should encourage, and others obviously are more welcomed. IDP leaders advocate for an international platform where they can share experiences and strategies nationally and internationally, a global platform for IDPs participation and leadership. And we agree that this is most needed. And as Yana well put it, we cannot stop advocating. We cannot stop taking action. Everything can change in one moment. The only thing we have is our voice, our presence. One second takeaway from this first panel is that IDP leadership affects and is related to mental health. IDP leaders represent communities, but if communities don't see changes, this undermines their leadership and their well-being at the end. The pressure is high. And at the end, IDPs are humans with emotions and with mental health challenges. Participation is not neutral, would be the third takeaway from my part. It can be detrimental if it raises risks and security issues. Also detrimental when it sustains and builds on pre-existing inequalities. IDPs may not want to participate, and the risk of greater frustration if the IDP situation does not change or changes take too long, as Farhad has shared, is also problematic. For the transfer of power It will be complete when IDPs can make decisions together. Only then will IDPs be at the center. Shared example of refugees managing training sessions were important. And ultimately, obviously, the basic and the enabler for everything, political will. We need a lot of political will, and that is lacking in today's leadership, unfortunately. Ishimwe told us that 1% of the resources goes to local organizations, and this demands restructuring, a change of mindset, and to new world order to center IDPs and other marginalized groups. So it's perfect time to call for power shifting, which is the whole and approach of this conference. On the second panel, we focus on displacement in cities and how food security, sustainable livelihoods, and climate resilience in cities can improve the lives of the displaced and others in cities where most of the internally displaced people are now living. So first, we saw that displacement puts pressure on cities, especially we heard today on secondary cities and towns. Huge strain on the demand for social services, housing, jobs, etc. And people end up living in informal and overcrowded areas. And there's a shift, we heard as well, on the need to invest in cities. Migration and displacement is part of the new development story, but at the same time, IDPs face enormous challenges in cities. It's always great to hear. I'm happy that we were joined today by the Cities Alliance, and particularly knowing that you're working so strongly in strengthening municipal capacities in the secondary cities and towns and investment to markets. We heard about solutions from the start, partnerships between humanitarian development actors, different funding needs to be sensitive to urban lens and municipal economy. It's not the same approach in all the settings. This has to have urban lenses and urban approaches and tools, mostly in the urban planning. Third, we heard about prevention and urban resilience, that both need to be attached to systems, to social protection systems, to contingency planning, to climate infrastructure, to early warning systems, to conflict prevention, and all should be inclusive of internally displaced persons and displacement sensitive. Transition to response to resilience building activities is seen mostly as an individual or household sphere, but it's not. It involves urban systems, and they all need to accommodate, to include IDPs lenses. The importance of data is to share the example of IDPs being miscategorized depending on their type of housing or assets that they happen to have for a minute, or for a house that looks better than others, but they're not able to access support or assistance. And then Jocelyn also shared how climate change data and modeling can help us prepare and mitigate disaster harm that we can already predict is coming. So in this way, data combined with systems and processes can contribute to life-saving efforts. And finally, let me finish with an important message from Farhad in this panel, which is this message that we've been hearing for many years, that nothing about us without us. And Farhad brought an important message on this. Come listen to us and understand us. He showed how displacement became more and more protracted despite more and more investment camps and that have been existing now for 11 years. So prevention of conflict and climate change is also key in this aspect, as we heard from this panel. And he also told us, in particular, he said, we need you, we are in pain, we are facing an existential struggle. If you don't listen to us, we won't be able to find the solutions we need. And I think this cry echoes many of the other voices that we heard today and the ones that were not present today, that we keep on listening. We know about our own solutions. Please put us in the front seat as well. So we are not where we need to be. I think it's the final conclusion, as we heard this very drastic panorama in some of the interventions, mostly from Jocelyn, I think, but some glimmers of hope as well from you and from everyone that we heard today are very important. So IDP leaders and others with forced displacement experience have more access to decision-making. I've been working on this for ages, and I think this is true. This is happening. Examples that Judy brought forward on municipal level investments and markets and government capacity are also very positive. UN Loss and Damage Fund, startup of the fund in 2026, funding eventually to communities at risk. So this is also good news, and we need to be very active in following this up. So I think this discussion helped reinvigorate thinking on how to do better on IDP participation and protection overall. Thank you again to the internally displaced persons, the survivors, and others with forced displacement experiences who joined us today. This is key. I think this was key for shifting mindsets and creative thinking. I look very much forward to working together on the action points that we came up with this morning. Thank you again, everyone. And this brings us, unfortunately, to the end of this conference. I wish you all a good rest of the week, and all of you take care. Thank you very much.